All right, Dan. I don't know if I told this before, but I feel like you're a little bit of like a Batman figure in my life because I keep hearing things about this guy, Dan Kidby, who's doing the wildest stuff in the UK. And then I see these amazing actions, going back to 2019 when you all got started at Animal Rebellion. And I kept thinking, who's this Dan Kidby guy? Who's Dan Kidby? And here you are in the flesh. And we've had one conversation before, but I'm really excited to
Hmm.
chat with you. Um, but yeah, I mean, maybe I'm
Likewise.
just kind of curious. How did you guys get this started? I mean, you've now organized some of the largest direct actions, I think, in the history of the animal rights movement. But how did this all get
Hmm.
started back in 2018? Like, what was the inspiration?
So I guess it depends on kind of how far back you want to go, really. So I was quite lucky in how I got into the social movement space because quite early on I met a guy called Roger Hallam, who was co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, and various other, and Just Stop Oil and loads of things in the UK that have been really, really large. And he kind of became a mentor for me very early on. He introduced me to books like Blueprint for Revolution, Gene Sharp, Martin Luther King, Civil Rights Movement, all of this kind of stuff. And it really it gave me a foundation in this idea that we can build mass movements. Um, and so I kind of rolled with him for a little while, watching him doing lots of small campaign experiments that were really precursors to Extinction Rebellion. We kind of set up an organization together called Radical Think Tank, which was me just basically following Roger around as his kind of like assistant and watching and learning all of these really amazing campaigns. Uh, then I kind of went off on my own journeys, got involved in animal rescue because I mean my heart was always really in animal rights
Hmm.
and embedded within a broader kind of like system change paradigm, I guess. Um, so I was going off on my own journeys, yeah, animal rescues, all of that kind of thing. And I remember in 2017 I returned back to the UK and was like, when I return back, I'm going to be doing this for real. And like what I want to do is build a mass movement for animals.
Hmm.
Uh, that actually through Almira. Well, actually, it was quite interesting because I had met Patty Mark in Australia. I told you this before, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah.
She connected me to Almira, and then Almira connected me to a guy in the UK called Mark Westcombe, who was also thinking about mass movement building.
Mm-hmm.
So then we rolled together and was kind of like, reading loads of books, having like 4 hour long conversations every evening, really just figuring out how the mechanics of how we can really build movements. That led into us, along with someone called Layla, starting Animal Think Tank,
Mm-hmm.
where we were really taking a very slow, meticulous approach to really learning as much as we could before we launched something. But amidst all of that, Roger set up Extinction Rebellion with others. And I had kind of been on the periphery of it, doing some support. Um, and when that went really big in April 2019, it was like, well, this is clearly the mass
The right thing
movement
to
we've
do.
been waiting for. It felt
Yeah.
like it at the time. So it was just a major pivot of like, we need to make something of this within the animal movement. It was like an opportunity to build a bridge between the animal and environmental spaces. There was an opportunity to plug plant-based food system as like a big thing as part of the national conversation and international conversation. So I remember I went on this retreat for like a few weeks. I went on like a few weeks before we launched, and I was talking to people on the retreat, and I was like, "Am I going to go and do this massive thing?" And I was like terrified. And then I came back like hyped for it, and then that's like defined the last 5 years of my life.
Well, yeah. So there's two things that help me understand how you became who you are and how Animal Rebellion and Animal
Mm,
Rights became what they are. One is that you you came into animal rights through climate stuff and through Roger Helm specifically because Roger's a genius. I mean, this guy, but
yeah.
he's a genius about direct action. He understands
Mm,
the sociological, the historical, the empirical basis for using nonviolent direct action to create change. And an Extinction Rebellion, I think probably more than any group in the world is
mm,
responsible for really changing the way the public thinks about climate change. I mean, even the notion that this is a climate crisis and not just it
mm,
just used to be just like one of many things that we kind of care about. But even the United States, I mean, Extinction Rebellion didn't have nearly as large a mobilization in the United States as in the UK. In the UK, it was just thousands of people getting arrested, unbelievable. But in the United States, they had a lot of little chapters and doing smaller scale things, and some people getting arrested, but not nearly as large. But it did just change the public narrative in a pretty dramatic way. And I think most people who get started in animal rights through animal rights groups don't do the sort of thing that Roger Allen does, which is really important. We need so much of it. But the other thing that doesn't surprise me is that you and Mark and Layla spent a lot of time thinking, because I think there definitely is a need for us to just take action. And I think, you could be biased on both sides. You can kind of move too quickly and just jump into stuff without thinking about it. You can also just spend too much time thinking, not do anything. There's so many academics. I mean, I'm a former academic, so I know this very well. Like a lot of extremely smart people could probably doing something good for the world who just sit in front of a computer all day. And I think the most effective movements really strike the balance. There has to be some opportunity for strategic deliberation and conversations like this one, which I'm one of the many reasons I'm really excited to talk to you about, because I want to learn more about your mobilization strategies and just figure out how the hell you've done all you've done, because I want to do it. And more importantly, the animals really need it. And I'd love to talk to you more about kind of what you learned from Roger about why these strategies are so important. But also, I want to start organizing stuff, and I'd love to hear more about what I can do to help you guys, because I know you have some big plans over the next few months, and super exciting. And sorry, probation officer, if you're offended right now. I promise you, I'm not gonna. Well, can I promise that? I guess I have to promise that. I have to be on good behavior. But everything I do is good behavior. Over the last 10 years, I don't think I've done anything that's bad behavior. But anyways, so how did you first get to meet Roger, and like what was the nature of that relationship?
So it's interesting because you said around getting involved with animal. Most people start off in animal rights. So I actually did start off in animal rights. So I had been at university, and I set up a Meat Free Mondays campaign. Was my first kind of like leap into social movement organizing, and I did it with a few people. I kind of stumbled across the Animal Rights Society at my university, and then went in and organized with them this campaign.
A little bit different than Animal Rebellion.
It is, yeah. But you got to start somewhere, right?
A little different than what you've done with Animal Rebellion and Animal Rights, but
yeah, you got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
And actually, that was a precursor to our plant-based universities campaign. Which, we can talk about a little bit later.
Yeah, for
sure. Yeah. So, and then what it's like. You meet people, and then they're involved in other stuff, and so. They just said to me, you know what, Dan, we're going and are going to be organising this occupation at London School of Economics. So come in and join in. And so I went along to this meeting, and there was like 25 people there. And then it was like the next day we're going to go into occupation. And then I was just straight in, and then I pretty much like I stopped going to class. I was like the best student, because I was planning on becoming an academic, sitting around thinking all the time. And then I suddenly found myself into this occupation where I just lived for 6 weeks and just had this like amazing. Oh yeah, it was like, and the thing is as well. Sorry, let me just get this going. So this occupation was very much. I always felt it was like a reboot of Occupy Wall Street, because David Graeber was a lecturer at London School of Economics. So. And he was there in the occupation every single day.
Wow.
And he was very much the kind of like the intellectual thought leadership of how we organized, how things were run. So
he was like the thought leader for the entire Occupy movement in the United States. David Graeber was the most important intellectual, just arguing for not just the occupations, but this massive political restructuring that was necessary to actually give people the freedom that we claim they deserve. But
yeah, and absolutely brilliant man, and he actually launched one of his books at that occupation, and I facilitated the discussion for the book launch. So one of my happy memories. But at this space, Roger just one day turned up, and he was just there I'm studying a PhD at King's College around mobilization, and he was like, I reckon we had this poster on the wall that said "Reinvent the wheel," and he pointed it out to me in the first conversation. He goes, you guys don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? It's like people have been figuring out how to do this stuff for decades. And then pretty much the entire occupation thought he was insane, and nobody really liked him. And I was like, you know what? I think he's onto something.
Huh.
And so me and him started hanging out, but yeah, no one else was really interested. So yeah, that's how he just rocked up.
Wow.
And he was at a time he was going around a lot of these movement spaces, just trying to support, trying to run experiments, trying to try out some of the techniques he'd been learning. And so yeah, that's
So
how I
wait, what
came to
was this
meet
an
him.
animal rights occupation, or was it more Occupy Wall Street style?
No, it was called Occupy LSE, and we set up what we called the Free University of London. So it was an open occupation. At max, we had like 1,000 people like coming along and or to our things. One day like Russell Brand came when he was very big in his political turn that he was taking, and so then we had to go and occupy the lecture theatre because so many students wanted to come and hear Russell Brand talk. So it was a real like hotbed of stuff. For some reason, it just like ignited something within the student movement. But because we were setting up as an educational space, we were running about like 10 workshops a week, and all of these people from across the social movement space were coming in and running stuff. So I just got this like fast track movement education there as well.
Wow.
Which was good and bad, because there's a lot of bad ideas floating around activism as well as a lot of good ones. And so I did take on a lot of bad ideas for a long time. But yeah, luckily, Roger began drumming those out of me.
Yeah, it's really weird how much learning happens from just being in the right physical space at the right time. So for example, I attribute a huge amount of my evolution as an activist to the fact that I just happened to be at the University of Chicago when there happened to be an extremely active vegan society, and specifically an active vegan society that included someone who had been convicted of felony and spent a year in jail on the Shack campaign and came back and was part of the core of that organization. And kind of just the spirit of radicalism, the openness that resulted from the fact that, because when I got started in the mid 2000s, and especially at these fancy universities like LSE or University of Chicago, I mean, elites tend not to join rebellions because they're elites. They're happy with the way things are. But elites are really important. You need to secure at least some portion of the elites to at least, kind of turn the tables on the systems of power. It's really important to get these turncoats. This is part of Erica Chenoweth's research. But if I hadn't been in that physical space, and it really was important to be like in this same room as my friend Josh, because up to that point in my life, I was such a rule follower and just never could have imagined myself doing all the things I've now done. I mean, I think if you asked me circa 2003, this is going to be your life. What do you think? What are the odds? I would have said, that's just impossible. I mean, it's more likely unicorns are found than this. But meeting Josh and then eventually Lauren.
So when was that? What year would that have been?
So I met Josh in 2003, and he had just come out of prison. So he the other thing, I didn't even know he had spent a year in prison until like a year after I met him. He was just a really smart, nice guy who was interested in animals and veganism. And when I first found out he had gone to prison, I honestly was scared. I thought, man, I can't be around a felon. It's so funny now because I had all these companies, but that's the way a lot of people think. And it's like, it's helpful for me to remember how I felt back in 2003, because it just shows you the importance of the direct action, civil disobedience, all the arrests. I mean, we're seeing it as a Gaza protest right now, not just Extinction Rebellion or what you all have done, but the Gaza protests 100% have seized national. I don't know if people in the UK are writing about this, but in the United States, every single newspaper in the country is only writing about the fact that 1,000 protesters got arrested. And for the first time, we're actually starting to have a real genuine conversation about whether the United States should revisit its policy in supporting Israel. And whatever you think about whether that's the right thing or the wrong thing, it's a pretty marvelous demonstration of the power of direct action. But for me, back in 2003, with no history, no experience, no research backing any of this, and I think this is the way most people come into movements, they don't come in with like a PhD dissertation in sociological theory. And very few people understand how change actually happens. It just felt
mm,
scary, you know?
mm.
And that's kind of one of the things, like you all do this so well where even like your pink shirts, I love the pink shirts. Like you do extremely radical things that get an enormous amount of attention, but you do it in a way that is very nonviolent and almost like innocent. You know, it feels very innocent, and it seems like
Times
that's
we've strayed
strategically
from that at
deliberate.
times, but yeah.
Is that
Mm.
strategically deliberate? Okay.
It is strategically deliberate, yeah. The pink was a very very conscious choice, yeah, because we were particularly we were at a time of doing like we knew we were going to be storming the tracks of the Grand National, was like kind of
Mm-hmm.
when we came up with these pink things. And actually, before that, we experimented with that as a color when we broke into MBR Acres, the beagle breeding facility, to rescue those dogs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it was yeah because we knew it was going to look potentially aggressive, and yeah, and you need to soften that, and I mean, you know what it's like. You got to go over and above to soften this stuff often.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you just yeah. What is it they say about nonviolence? It's like because you're bringing that conflict to the surface, you have to just do an extra job of being nice and
Yeah.
friendly and building relationships because it's so much harder to do so. But it's just integral to the whole theory of change.
Yeah. No, I think that's part of the reason Josh didn't ultimately terrify me away from the vegan society at the University of Chicago. Because
Mm,
he was just a super soft spoken, quiet, peaceful
yeah.
guy. And then when I heard this guy had basically taken I don't remember if he personally took a hammer to a window or if he was just part of the group, but it was three people back in,
Mm,
I think 2001 or 2002 was when they were convicted in New York. And he spent time in the most notorious prison in New York, Rikers, an entire year and was convicted of a felony.
mm,
And all they did was break a window. I mean, that's it. You know, how many times do
mm,
windows get broken in cars and, buildings all over the country, and there's very rarely any sort of consequences. But because it was a political protest, they went hard after these guys.
mm,
But again, as someone who had followed the rules my entire life and never saw myself as like a rebel in any way, the fact that Josh was just like a sweet guy made a pretty big
mm,
difference to me. Not that even persuaded me. I mean, it took a while to persuade me that these tactics are right, but the fact that he was such a nice guy
mm.
opened the door for me. It made it possible for me to even continue having the conversation with him. Um, so yeah, Josh, if you're out there, I haven't talked to him in
So
years.
question for you. So what were you? Because you're saying like someone who's followed the rules your whole life. Like, what were you like at school?
Uh, Most people had no idea I was even there, honestly. Like I think
Mm,
until later. I mean, I definitely was independent minded and I had a lot of
mm,
different thoughts and I jumped around a lot. But I mean, if you ask my college classmates, for example, I didn't have a single friend. I don't think anyone remembers me at all. Like, because I just did my
mm.
own thing. I had very few friends. I was very isolated. Um, but that also gave
Why is that?
me,
Were you just did you have a very rich like inner life going on and like
oh,
thinking
no, no,
about
no,
things
no,
that
no.
nobody else were interested in?
No, my inner life was pretty much entirely grounded in social anxiety. I mean, I was just scared of everybody. I was
Uh,
constantly living in fear. I
mm,
mean, this is like a lot of Chinese kids. I mean, my mom was a tiger mom and she scared the shit out of me every single day. And I loved her. I mean, she was an amazing mom and she drove me.
mm,
I, I, I attribute a lot of my successes to my mom because she was the hardest worker I ever met. And she taught me the value of
mm,
focus and discipline, but she definitely did
mm,
not give me space to think independently. And I lived in fear my entire life, basically, of my mom's, if
mm,
not, because back in the day, I don't know if you got hit, but especially with Chinese parents, I mean, corporal punishment was the
mm,
most common way of disciplining your kids when I was growing up. So
mm,
even when I spilled water or dropped something, I'd get struck. And certainly if I
mm,
messed up in school, and for my mom, messing up in school was an A minus, not even,
mm.
or sometimes even, I
Oh yeah,
remember,
wow.
so like we have this entrance exam that we take in the United States. And I think I got like a 1590 out of 1600, which is like the 99.9 percentile. My mom
Mm.
didn't get upset. And like, because back then I was a teenager, so it'd be embarrassing to hit me, but she was pretty upset about it. She was like,
Oh wow.
you've got to do better than this. So that was kind of the mentality my mom had. Um,
Mm,
so I definitely had thoughts about things. And, I've talked about this before, that fundamentally, I think the reason I became independent minded was because of animals, because I had an experience when I was growing up where I saw dogs being
Mm,
killed, and it just messed me up. It left me with night terrors.
mm,
I had a nightmare a couple of days ago about this. It happened when I was 8 years
mm.
old, and it's not exactly the same nightmare, but I have this nightmare that's recurring of having an animal suffering right in front of me and being unable to help them, and just trying and failing. And it's a terrible nightmare, but it all comes back to being an 8-year-old kid. But even though I had that impulse, I didn't really explore it that much until much later in life. So I don't know.
Wow. But it's quite interesting because I think we're opposites in quite a lot of ways. Like at school, I was quite rebellious in school. I almost got expelled
Mm,
but I wasn't like rebellious in like I just kind of I think for me like one I was bored in school a lot of the time,
mm,
and so I was testing and just like yeah testing the teachers a lot, but also I really struggled with the kind of like arbitrary nature of like a lot of like the decision making that was going on, and like the rules, and I would question a lot, and so that was driving me quite a lot to be quite naughty in school. And also I was just kind of quite prone to just I don't know I smoked a lot of weed when I was young, and so it's just kind of fried a few brain cells, all that
nice.
kind of stuff. So I wasn't really studious in that kind of way.
Huh.
But I think also there was an element of like yeah, there was boredom and there was like a lack of aspiration because I grew up in a very working class kind of community, like
Mm,
uh, and there was no like I went on to study law, like you did. But the reason I did is because I'd seen it on telly and I'd seen lawyers on telly and thought that sounds like a good job, and I had no concept of what it meant to be a lawyer.
huh.
And then when you get to uni, you discover there are professions like consultancy
Yeah.
and and you learn about this other world. Um, uh, but like the animal thing came quite late for me
Mm,
actually. And it was like I kind of paid no mind whatsoever to animals for pretty much my entire life. I had no real relationships with animals as a kid,
mm,
so no like nice stories to be able to tell. But just in like 2013, 14, I just got into meditation,
mm,
and meditation just kind of like opened me up, like from a compassionate point of view, I guess, and started getting me caring about all kinds of different social issues. And then once, at some point, the question came into my head around why do I eat animals? And I was like, I should probably think about that. And it was a very logical thing of like, logically, I couldn't justify it. So then I stopped.
interesting.
And it took me years of being an activist before I actually like built relationships with animals. And actually, I used to say I'm not an animal lover. I just like think that it's wrong.
Yeah.
Um, but now that's changed, and I do see myself as an animal lover as well.
Mm,
But yeah, it's taken time.
interesting.
Um, yeah,
Do you still meditate a lot now?
uh, not as much as I should.
Yeah, I hear you now.
I find, to be honest, I find it hard with the organizing. Um,
Yeah.
Gandhi used to say he would insist on meditating an hour every day, and he would do 2 hours if he
It's
had like a
stress.
really
Yeah.
busy, hard day ahead of him. Like I don't do that.
Yeah.
My meditation is the first thing to go out the window
Yeah.
when the work's going on, and yeah, I haven't mastered it, even though I do think it's essential for me doing this work well, especially over the long term.
Yeah. I'm struck by how many people I've met over the years who have reached some sort of new consciousness, or even just some new strategic insight from meditation. Because so
Mm,
often your brain is just caught up in the day, which is why I'm glad. I mean, I know you've taken some sabbaticals and you're thinking about doing it. I mean, on the one hand, I think to myself,
mm,
it's really sad because I know you're a dynamite organizer and you've done this like tremendous stuff. On the other hand, I know it's really important for the brain just to get out of its normal routines. And that's what meditation does. It
mm,
allows you to kind of step outside of your own brain. Um, I've even thought that, well, two things. One is that we should actually train people to meditate within the movement. That, you
yeah, I
know,
thought that too.
that would actually be good for the movement. And in many ways, I agree with Gandhi that the more stressed you are, the more meditation you need. But realistically for me, I mean, when I've had a practice, and it goes off and on for me too, especially when I'm in the middle of the trial, for example, it's just and I've been in the middle of trials constantly over the last couple of years. Even 10 minutes a day has been hard, but I usually shoot for just 10 minutes a day. And I think that you get most of the value from meditation out of 10 minutes a day. But the other thing I've thought is we should expand the movement's recruiting and development to meditation circles, because meditation is becoming a big thing around the world. And just creating an intersection between the communities that are meditating and taking that really seriously and the communities that are trying to create a more compassionate world for animals seems like a thoughtful thing to do. I've got a good buddy named John Frommeyer, who I'm not allowed to talk to anymore, but he's a very serious meditator and a certified yoga instructor. He's also really into psilocybin and psychedelics. And what he's told me is the only way he's been able to achieve the sort of higher states of consciousness and reflection without the use of other substances is meditation. That you can actually get to basically the same state that you're in when you're on psilocybin, which is pretty mind-blowing to me. But I felt that myself. There are times when you're meditating and it feels like you're kind of floating. I don't know how to describe it when you've done it. Actually, I was going to say, it's not even necessarily the length. It's just the state of mind. Sometimes it's just, you're just in the right state of mind. You meditate and you start feeling very detached from everything, but also very connected to everything. You're sort of detached from your own experience, but connected to everything else. And it's really, really powerful. And I can see how, I mean, I reached my animal rights consciousness a little bit earlier than my meditation practice, but I can see how the meditation practice does allow you to attach yourself to the experiences of other people. Even honestly, the most useful thing for me over the last couple of years of meditation is kind of understanding internal conflicts within the movement. It's been super helpful for me to just meditate, and I just see my adversaries within the movement and outside of the movement too. But in many ways, it's easier to empathize for me, and this is kind of a weird thing to say, to people outside of the movement than people inside of the movement, because people inside of the movement, you have this sense of just betrayal. It's not just you're an adversary. It's like, dude, what the hell are you doing? Why are you wasting so much time trying to bring me down? And it creates this dark resentment and almost cancer in you. And meditation has helped me a lot in trying to bounce back from that. But anyways.
Yeah, I think it's because, like, you know, it's like it's harder to, like, you know, your family, if they're like doing harm, and then it's harder. It's always harder your peers and your, you know, friends or people who you align yourself with. And so I definitely struggle with that. Like I empathize with Trump way more than I empathize with like an activist that I do an action with at Animal Rising, for instance. So it's a funny way, but yeah, no, the bringing meditation in, I do think, is very important. Like I have been quite, you know, thinking a lot more around, like, the Indian independence and the civil rights movement. So they just have a different quality, it seems to me, in terms of like what they were putting out into the world and the energy that they were putting out there. And it really does strike me that they were very much rooted in these like religious, like spiritual movements as well. And like, actually, I read this amazing book like a year ago talking about the Birmingham campaign, like the way that they were recruiting their activists, and they got them to sign this card, and there was 10 points of like what they would do by joining the movement. And step one was that they're going to meditate every day on the teachings of Christ.
Wow.
And that was what they were asking, just of their on the ground activists that were taking direct action. And that like really did inspire me, that like, because it's having, it doesn't have to be meditation, you know, there's different ways you can do it, but having some form of contemplative practice that connects you into nonviolence on a deeper level, I think is so important. Because, you know, we've seen many times throughout history progressive justice-based movements entirely lose their way and become the things that they're fighting against. And I think we don't really recognize that within progressive circles, that we're just as susceptible to the trappings of power and all the other things that other people are. So building that consciousness, I do see, is really important.
Yeah, when you read King and Gandhi, they talk constantly about spiritual force. For a lot of us, I don't know if you're religious, but I'm Buddhist, but it's completely philosophical. I'm a devout atheist. I don't think there's anything non-material in the world. And I remember first reading some of King's writings and obviously being inspired by a lot of it, because it's hard to read the letter from a
Mm,
Birmingham jail or even the March on Washington's the speech he gave there and not say this is just excellent writing. I mean, it's beautiful writing. It's just wonderful to read, but
yeah.
also parts of it just sound very dated. I just feel like,
Mm,
and I've just, but there is this spiritual force to it that even if you're an
mm,
atheist, there's this emotional and cultural tone that is just
mm,
apparent throughout the movement. And you see it in the
mm,
actions of the activists. You see it in their words. You see it in the songs they're singing together. And
yeah.
it goes back to this thing we were talking about at the start of this conversation, where you can do some pretty radical things. And if you do them in a way that
Mm,
is perceived as very peaceful, people will be more
yeah.
open to it. And you can seize the power of dramatic actions without turning
Mm,
people against you permanently, if you do it
mm,
with the right tone. And that's something Erica
mm,
Chenoweth taught us. And I know you guys, I'm sure you follow Erica Chenoweth's work, and she's the Harvard
yeah.
professor who wrote Why Civil Resistance Works, and has this rule 3.5%, where if you hit 3.5% of the population sustain nonviolent direct action, you win every single time. And one of the things she told me that really, really hit me hard, and we tried to integrate in our activism and often failed, to be honest. I actually think you guys have done a better job of this. Is she told me nonviolence is actually not about what you do; it's about how it's perceived. So you can do some
Mm,
pretty violent things, and as long as it's perceived as
mm,
nonviolent, it's like a lot of things that I would think are kind of violent. It's fine as long as it's perceived as nonviolent. And in contrast, you can do things that are completely peaceful. So in the example she
mm,
gave of an action that Occupy did, it was actually right next door to here. So Occupy Wall Street just, I'm sure, I mean, I'm sure you followed Occupy. How old are you, Dan?
yeah.
Okay.
How old am I now? I'm 32 now.
So you were pretty
I had a
young. So
birthday recently.
so you were pretty
Yeah, yeah,
young. You were
yeah.
like in your early 20s, late teens when Occupy was going up.
Yeah, like I was aware of Occupy.
Okay.
I was aware of it, but I wasn't political then.
Okay.
So it's just, yeah,
So, but in the United States, it
I think
was,
I was moaning
I think it
about it.
got pretty big in London too, but in the United States, it was huge. I mean, I was in
Mm,
Chicago, and it was unbelievable how many people were just walking around in this huge park. And compared to New York, Chicago was nothing. But
mm,
in the Bay Area, I hadn't moved to the Bay Area yet. I was living in Chicago at the time. But in the Bay Area, the protests got massive too in Oakland. And the single example that Erica Chenoweth gave about how the Occupy movement just lost the plot and fell apart, and because
mm,
they were engendering a lot of public support, especially when they're getting arrested. If you look at the graph, is pretty fascinating. When you look at kind of the number of media hits and the size of the
mm,
demonstrations, Roger
yeah.
Hallam is 100% right about this. The arrest drove the entire thing. Like every time there was a
Mm,
surge in arrest, there's a surge in attention. You look at the Gaza protests in the United States now too. You got
mm,
basically, what is it, couple thousand kids who've gotten arrested,
mm,
and every single newspaper in the country is just writing about Gaza on the front page.
yeah.
It's bigger than the Trump trial. We have a former president who's possibly going to
Wow.
go to jail, and the New York Times, and the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal are only writing about these student protests. I'm sure Trump is pissed because he's like, dude, I'm going to jail. No one even wants to hear about my story just because all these kids are getting arrested. But the thing
Mm,
that caused Occupy to fall apart, even in the face of all these people making incredible sacrifices and doing just like incredible activism about a real issue,
mm,
economic inequality, it seems so stupid. But someone burned the American flag in Oakland,
mm,
and
yeah.
that's actually a very peaceful action. It was their own
Mm,
property. They're totally allowed to do that. It was not illegal. It was not violent. I mean, you can burn whatever you want. You can burn a
mm,
piece of paper. You can burn your iPhone. You're allowed to burn whatever the hell you want. Flags are
mm,
property. They're not people. So you can burn your flag. In fact, there's even Supreme Court precedent that the government's not allowed to criminalize burning the American flag, even in public places. It's
mm,
constitutionally protected in the United States. And there was this person who was an organizer in Oakland who just burned the American flag. And even though it was a completely peaceful action, everyone perceived it as threatening because they symbolically
mm,
thought, what are you going to burn next? Are you going to burn my home down, or are you going to burn our time? It was like this weird symbolic violence. Um,
mm,
and it led to, and a lot of people reported on it. And, obviously the
mm,
adversaries of the movement used it to undermine Occupy.
mm,
And I don't think it's the only reason the movement fell apart. But that sort of symbolism was the thing that the Occupy
mm,
movement never really quite figured out. and it ultimately was the
Yeah.
downfall of the movement. That and
Mm.
infighting. I think the two things that really caused the downfall
Mm.
were the inability to deal with like the black bloc, Antifa
Yeah.
narrative, because that was when Antifa first became a thing too, and everybody in the
Mm.
right, and honestly a lot of moderates, sort of complaining about Antifa this, Antifa that. It's like Antifa's like 1% of this protest, and everyone's just talking about the
Mm.
goddamn Antifa folks. And what do you think about them? Who cares?
Mm.
But the movement never really figured out what to do about this element of the movement that did endorse violence. And then, second thing,
Yeah.
even the part of the movement that was nonviolent, they never really understood how narrative is more important than the actual moral and physical reality of what you've done. And so,
Yeah.
and I'm actually pretty worried about the Gaza protests right now, because a lot of the students are making the same mistakes that the Occupy protesters made, and they're just not learning the lessons of
Mm.
what happened 14 years ago to Occupy Wall Street.
Mm.
So
Mm.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's a hard because I mean we haven't been perfect on the getting the tone right and non-violence front.
Yeah.
I think because I mean there's a big learning that I've had is you kind of set yourself on a pathway to and like so we started in 2022 doing like a campaign of like to stop the supply of dairy.
Mm-hmm.
So and this was amidst like Just Stop Oil were going and disrupting oil terminals and trying to stop the flow of fuel into the country. And there was this big like material disruption turn
Mm-hmm.
that the movements had taken, and so we kind of like followed into that. And so our goal was to we're going to stop. We're going to make it so there's no milk on the supermarket shelves.
Mm-hmm.
And so once you set yourself that objective, then and then you build a campaign around it, and then you mobilize hundreds of people to go and take direct action to stop the supply of dairy. And then you rock up and you find that the tactic that previously used to work of going and sitting on top of milk silos at the entrance of the distribution centers would effectively shut down the place was no longer working because the police had adapted
Mm-hmm.
and they would be responding to that. So then you've got hundreds of people, and it's
Yeah,
like, well, then what do you do?
Yeah.
And so then very
I know that
quickly
feeling.
and then very quickly the action escalated. So like, okay, well, go and drill tires then, because that will stop the trucks. And it's like, and then so suddenly you've got the objective, and then you're drilling some tires, and then people are going and drilling an entire truck park of tires, and like hundreds of tires getting drilled, and there's videos going and just drill. And
so that was completely spontaneous.
That was spontaneous.
Wow,
That was the development through the campaign of tactical innovation,
Yep.
plus the phenomenon of shoving a group of people into a house together,
Mm-hmm.
the thrill of action, the excitement of action, and then the very quick escalation that happens under those very, very unique conditions. As well as a load of all the great stuff of the hyperconnectivity, the friendships that get formed, all of these things, like people saying it's like the best week of my life. All of this stuff's happening as well, and amidst that is the escalation, which wasn't strategically planned for.
Mm-hmm.
And this is like something in the design that I've really learned is you have to plan for the nature of a group.
Mm-hmm.
and the foundation, the logical foundation that you build something on, and where it's likely to go. And so actually, like the tire drilling, I mean, it wasn't like it was okay, but like it hasn't caused us much in the way of blowback from like a public perception point of view, luckily. We were doing it very open, people could see our faces and all this kind of stuff. But what was really interesting afterwards was because then you're in that material disruption frame. And then people were like, where do we go next?
Mm-hmm.
And then you start hearing whisperings from people of like, we should go and burn down the slaughterhouse.
Mm-hmm.
And all of this kind of stuff like starts being spoken about in the movement. And then Andreas Malm, which he may have, I don't know if he made his way over to America, but he'd written a book like how to blow up a pipeline. And so then those ideas, so they were coming in as well. And along with this escalation, and it took like a pulling back and a seeing this process unfolding, and a need to really, it took a very heavy intervention really into the space to bring in a foundation of this principled form of nonviolence, and shifting the theory of change away from this material disruption, through to, like all the narrative shifting and all of the mass participation stuff that, I think we're both very much aligned on in terms of how we do this stuff. But like, had that not been done, like, who knows where the movement would have gone off to? So it's like, it was a big learning for me in terms of like the theory. You encounter things in the real life organization. It's just like you could never have imagined until you experience it and live through it. And it's like, oh crap, okay, that's something that humans do. That's something that I do. I thought I was immune to
Yeah.
that. All this kind of stuff.
Yeah, just even just the power of polarization to create this sense of battle, which is often a good thing. And Roger, for example, has written and spoken a lot about this, how polarization can be a very useful thing. But then understanding how that can carry you in directions that are very, very not just non-strategic, but potentially unethical, right? Where and you mentioned this before. I mean, my family's history is just evidence of this, because my family was on the losing side of civil war in China in 1949. Not literally me, but my dad. He was in China in 1949, was as a baby, and his family was on the wrong side of the civil war. They were academics, so they at least weren't soldiers, but they were literally part of a nationalist government that had terrorized peasants for hundreds of years. So they were the elites. And Mao Zedong was a legitimate social justice advocate. I mean, he really did believe, and I get in trouble for saying this because he was also a mass murderer, killed tens of millions of people, but I think he had good intentions. He was trying to do the right thing, and he saw a profound injustice in the world, like millions of people being, hundreds of millions of Chinese people being brutally oppressed by this nationalist regime that was a dictatorship. It was a legitimate fascist state. But he became what he opposed, because once he decided, I'm going to use violent tactics to stop this, he created something that was even worse than what the nationalists were doing. I mean, they likely killed hundreds of thousands of dissidents, maybe millions, but almost certainly not tens of millions. And then Mao created a system. If you read about, most Americans, people in the West don't know about this, but Mao was probably the greatest mass murderer in human history in terms of the number of bodies. Because in the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, they sent literally tens of millions of people to concentration camps who were dissidents. And oftentimes, it didn't even require you to actually be a dissident in the sense that you actually said something that disagreed with the regime. You just had to be the wrong type of person, right? If you were a teacher, you were a scientist, you were a family member of someone who was part of the nationalist regime back in 1949, my grandparents on both sides of my family had to make this really difficult decision as to whether to flee, because they were leaving a lot of their family members behind. But they made the right call because they saw the writing on the wall, and the writing on the wall was mass murder of all the opposition. And that's just a lesson of history. You look at Lenin too. I mean, Lenin, in many ways, if you look at Lenin up until, say, the mid 1920s or the late 1920s, he's kind of a hero. He would be known as a Martin Luther King Jr. type in a lot of senses, in that he sacrificed an immense amount. He was, again, a very privileged person, a lawyer. He went to Moscow State University, which is the best university in Moscow, and threw it all away to fight for the working class. Just threw it all away. I mean, his brother too. His brother got executed by the Tsar, and so he was incredibly brave and had this deep, profound compassion for people who are suffering. But in fighting that suffering, he became the same monster and ended up ordering assassinations, not just of czarist, hacks and lackeys, but he ended up killing his own former colleagues, because once you start using that violent tactic and you decide the ends justify the means, it's hard to have a limiting principle and say, okay, well, this is where we stop. So I don't know where you stand on kind of the debate between principled and strategic nonviolence, but my view is that they're kind of the same thing, because the only way for you to get to the strategic outcome of a movement that actually builds a better place is to take a stand of principled nonviolence. And part of that is because it just infuses the culture of the entire thing. And I agree with you 100%. If there's one mistake I made in starting DXE, because I had never organized at scale before Direct Action Everywhere. I had always been a part of these little groups of 5, 10, 15 people. And then Direct action org was the first time I was involved in hundreds and eventually thousands of people. And the number one mistake I made was not understanding the importance of internal strategy. External strategy, I feel like I've learned a little bit over the last 10 years, but honestly, my external strategy is pretty much the same. How do you change the world? I kind of get that. Most of the things I've learned are about how you actually organize internally and scale that to the point that you get to tens or hundreds of thousands of people. And I'm still learning a lot about that. And one of the things that's been super cool in watching you all is, and even just talking to somebody like Ben and Rose, like I've been having some conversations about Rose. It's kind of an obvious thing, but I'm pretty blown away by the fact that one, your core training is a nonviolence training. That's a thing that everyone comes in through that. That's super cool. And I never even thought about that as being like the core training that everyone just comes in because it sets the culture right from day one. You come in, you understand this is a nonviolent movement. The other thing that's really cool is, and this has to do with your interesting view on security culture, right? But you kind of just tell people what you're going to do and say like, hey, and by the way, this nonviolence training is going to lead you to be a part of these badass actions that are super exciting and inspiring and will create change. And the US movement, and it sounds like elements of the UK movement, have been so concerned about security that when I first heard you do that, and like I think I knew about this because I heard about what happened to the Grand National disruption. Which is so the Grand National, I think, is like the Kentucky Derby in the United States. It's like the biggest horse race in the UK. Is that right? Okay. And
here in the world, actually,
the biggest in the world. So it's probably bigger than Kentucky Derby. So, but when I first heard, you guys just basically brought all these random people in the room together and said, "Oh, by the way, we're going to go disrupt the biggest horse race in the world, and you can be a part of this." I was like, "Wait a minute, how you can't do that?" But you did, and it ended up being really successful in so many ways. But yeah, just thinking.
And of course, the Daily Mail infiltrated those meetings and then put it on the front page of the newspaper and said the vegans are coming basically to disrupt the horse race.
Yeah.
And then we had this. It was this. This is like where the open organizing really it gets challenged at times, and because we went into a strategy meeting at like 2 a.m. because we knew this headline was coming out, and we're like, what do we do? What do we do?
Yeah.
And I remember going into that meeting going, this is fantastic. They've started the conversation 3 weeks early. Now we have 3 weeks of drama. Yeah. We just put out a press release saying we're coming anyway. So we did. And then you then had 3 weeks of build up, and it was excellent. And this is the beauty of the open organizing, is you can never have an opportunity of being in the conversation for 3 weeks on the build up to an action, unless if you're organizing this kind of way.
Yeah.
And we mobilized off the back of it as well. We put out a thing, we organized the mobilization call, sucked people in, plugged more people into the action as a result of that. Yeah,
I think one of the things we learned from that episode, or at least I learned from that episode, or maybe not learned, because I already thought this was true, but relearned, and we have to relearn this lesson over and over again, is at the end of the day, helping 1, 2, even 100 animals is obviously really valuable. But fundamentally, if we're going to help them all, this is a battle of stories and of communications.
Yeah.
And I can imagine a lot of people would say, well, but we didn't disrupt the race. We didn't materially stop these animals from being raced. In the same way that historically, one of the reasons open rescue work has been so confidential is because, well, we want to help the animals. I mean, how are we going to save these animals? And again, that's an important goal, and we should do that. But no matter how many animals you save, even if you're saving dozens or hundreds or even thousands of animals, it's still just a drop in the bucket compared to the system we're trying to fight. And this is another one of the really beautiful things about Rising and Animal Rebellion, just the focus on systemic change, which, so many movements in animal rights, and certainly I think probably for you and certainly for me when I got started as animal rights, everything was focused on individual change and consumer change. It was just, okay, how do we get people to go vegan? How do we get people to change their minds? Or even the most ambitious projects were things like, how do we get this individual to change politically to vote for animal rights legislation? That was like the ambitious activism. And now we see this new wave, which Extinction Rebellion was certainly a part of this, the Sunrise movement, where there's been a big shift in both the environmental movement and the animal rights movement away from individual change towards systemic change. And once you start thinking about systemic change, you realize, okay, it's not that the individuals don't matter, because the individuals are obviously symbols and they're stories for us to harness, and they're important demonstrations for the bigger systemic change we're trying to create. But at the end of the day, the system is what we're trying to change, and we cannot stop that system without having narratives that really just move people. And sometimes
Mm.
you can get a good narrative without even disrupting the horse race, just by talking about it. That can be enough. So, yeah.
Yeah, and the systemic change is, well, actually, just a note first in terms of the stories, because it's hard, because like for me, I was always like, it's fine because we're telling the story, right? But we had, because we were doing these actions that were specifically targeted towards races. There's high security. It's hard to get in when they know you're coming. The industry responded by putting up all these big fences, by shoving loads of police in, and these cat and mouse type actions where you're trying to evade the police and get past them, get yourself into a space, they're basically impossible to pull off when they know you're coming. So we had a number of these actions where, even though we were getting all of this press coverage, actually like the base of people that we were trying to organize became really frustrated because they needed that material disruption as well. And the idea of the story, though it was enough for me personally, and say for others who were kind of like strategically organizing things, it wasn't enough to sustain the base. They needed to feel those wins. They needed to feel that their bodies were getting in the way. So yeah, you need both.
Yeah.
And I remember at the time I was quite frustrated by it. I was like, people should see this.
Yeah,
but it's
there's
like,
value in this.
but that doesn't help getting the frustration, because you need to, different people take courage and take morale from different elements, and so they all need building in as well. But in terms of the systemic change, this is the pivot that like I was really, when setting up what was before Animal Rebellion in 2019. This was the big thing that we really sought to inject in the movement in a big way, because it had been, you guys over at Direct Action Everywhere have been injecting this systemic change stuff, but the whole movement had either been steeped in welfare reforms or individual outreach and kind of like a go vegan thing, wasn't it? And so strategically, when setting up Animal Rebellion, the goal was to really shift the movement towards taking on this systemic change ask. And so that's why we kind of brought in this framing of this, where it's evolved over the years, the supporting farmers to transition to a plant-based food system. And I remember when we launched Animal Rebellion, we brought together about 15 or 16 of like the animal rights organizations in the UK, and we talked through the plan. We said, we're going to organize this mass civil disobedience. We're going to go occupy and blockade meat markets and fish markets and all this kind of stuff. And narratively, we're pushing the system change ask. And we went through the kind of like the rationale for that, and we talked it through based on theory and all this kind of other stuff. And the movement, like you had a lot of movement leaders there from lots of different organizations, and there was a lot of resistance to this idea of like, what, you're not talking about going vegan?
Yeah.
And we really like completely didn't do anything go vegan whatsoever. Because we also knew that if we were going into solidarity with the environmental movement, if there was even a smidgen of like go vegan in our culture, all you would have had is a load of vegans rocking up to the environmental protest and then trying to outreach all the environment, and it would have destroyed any sense of solidarity or connectivity. So we really had to go quite anti a go vegan thing in order to pull off what we needed to do. Even though I'm not like anti it. I think there's a role for this kind of personal transformation stuff. But providing that space for people to chew over the ideas, I think did lead to like a somewhat of a shift towards this systemic change within the movement in general. And like we did see, and we have seen, like organizations really adopting this plant-based food system narrative. And it's quite nice that like organizations now, often they're at least doing them like half and half, like a go vegan and a plant-based food system. And once you've got that framing embedded, though, which is a systemic change framing, then over the years, more and more projects are going to emerge, I think, that are going to fit under that narrative. And we're already like slowly starting to see more kind of things in that direction. But one thing that's like really, really important to me, because I feel like, I mean, I don't know how you feel about this, but like my sense is the animal movement's really like politically naive,
Mm.
um, in that
100%. 100%.
we kind of, yeah, like we think that we're like so far away from change.
Yeah.
Like the narratives I often hear from people is like, we don't really have people, we don't have many politicians, we don't have many people in key institutions, and like all of this kind of stuff. And like we're not in a position to make systemic change. But it kind of ignores the fact that we're in a climate emergency. Like you've got massive technological changes happening with AI. You've got the loss of trust in key institutions across the Western world. You've got a massively changing political system where fascism's on the rise and probably like progressive alternatives are on the rise. The broad social space is calling for transformation pretty much across the entire political spectrum. Right wingers and left wingers are all calling for political transformation, and and within that context, and only within that context, is there actually like a huge opportunity for massive changes to animal farming. And like, but the animal movement isn't. I don't think a lot of people are aware of it, but very few people are strategizing from looking at that context. Most people are strategizing from looking at the context of we only have 1% of vegans.
Yeah.
But it ignores the fact that actually like 40% of the population, in terms of stuff that we've been doing, are in favor of broad major systemic shifts that would lead in the direction towards 100% plant-based transition. 75% of the population are in favor of ending factory farming and all of this kind of stuff. And we're instead focusing on this 1% of who's actually being this pure vegan. So yeah, I think we're just massively missing a trick, and so much more is possible than people realize.
Yeah. I'm 100% in agreement with that. And and one of the most disturbing things about that mentality is it's to a certain extent a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if everyone keeps saying that, then no one does the work, and no one's able to achieve, even the people doing the work aren't able to achieve the support, because there's enormous amount of evidence. I mean, you don't have to believe in the law of attraction, which I don't. I think it's hard for any of you who listen to some guru who talks about that, but I think it's nonsense, because again, I'm a materialist. I think everything in the material world is what we see, and it's the extent of the universe. But there's enormous amount of evidence in social movement theory and evidence in particular, but particularly the scholar Doug McAdam at Stanford, that movements succeed when they think they can succeed. If you don't have a positive vision and show people, and the concept is called cognitive liberation that Doug McAdam came up with. And sometimes you can even see the inflection point. You can literally look in surveys and find that, for example, in the civil rights movement in the United States, starting in the 1950s and 60s, at the very time where the KKK was murdering people across the country, where thousands of activists are getting jailed, even white people who are part of the movement were getting firebombed for just being supportive of things like voting for people of color in this country. Black people were getting more and more optimistic about the prospects of political change. And in our movement, it's almost like this fashionable cynicism. I was listening to this podcast a couple of days ago that you probably enjoy too. It's by a journalist in the United States named Ezra Klein, who's among the most important journalists in the entire country. He's a columnist of the New York Times, and he has a podcast, which is a great podcast. And he's actually talking to someone who I didn't even know was a vegan, but they're both vegan. He was talking to someone who's the executive director of a group called Our World in Data about the climate consequences of various, basically, economic systems around us. And food obviously drives a huge amount of not just climate destruction, but extinctions. Like we're in the sixth mass extinction. It's a faster rate of extinction than any of the historical episodes of extinction in this planet's history. And almost all of it's being caused by livestock. It's not even climate change. It's just literally taking all the animals' homes, replacing wild systems with huge cattle ranches. That's essentially why we're killing off all the species on the planet Earth. And the entire podcast is about how, man, there are all these reasons we really need to change our food system, but that's kind of impossible. So they don't even. It's so depressing, because they say, but the reason they conclude it's impossible is because it's the V word. They say, we're both vegan, but we can't convince anyone else to go vegan, so I guess we just give up. And it's just,
Mm,
it's mind-blowing to me that people think this way, because if you look at first of all, I think if you look at not the percentage of vegans or the percentage of people who want to go vegan, I think you're right that most
mm,
people around not just the country but the world, and every country, do support
mm,
policies and systems that protect animals from violence. In the United
mm,
States, there's this shocking survey, shocking to a lot of people, not to me, that was released, and I think it was 2019 by the Sentience Institute, showing that 1 in 2
mm.
Americans wanted to ban slaughterhouses and factory farms, just outright ban them.
Yep.
And then
Mm,
there's this agricultural economist who works for the pork industry. His name is Bailey Norwood. I think he works at the University of Oklahoma. He saw this being publicized
mm.
and said, "This is bullshit. This is clearly like animal rights propaganda." And so he replicates it, and the number goes up in his survey.
Yeah, yeah,
It
yeah.
went from like 47 to
Yeah, I
49.
remember this.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
was and he was like, he tweeted about this and said, "I don't know what to make of this. This is very confusing to me, because I and everybody I know eat animals, yet half of us apparently want to ban slaughterhouses and factory farms." But to me, that's such a powerful demonstration of the political opportunity there. And you're right that
Yeah,
in
yeah,
times of
yeah.
crisis, institutions are revisited. This is like an opportunity for us to
Mm,
rewrite. There's this old Chinese adage that every crisis is an opportunity. The Chinese word is literally weiji,
mm,
and weiji.
mm,
The second part of that is the same word as that's used in an important opportunity, weiji and jihui, and
mm,
they're kind of the same thing. And we know so many things are going to be written in the next 10, 15 years because of all these crises,
mm.
and it's just up to us to author the change we want to happen, right?
Yeah, and I think the thing of like this like hyper focus on like personal transformation on veganism, like there's this like idea that flows around the vegan space that like it frustrates me so much, which is that it's easy to be a vegan.
Yeah,
And people say you don't have to sacrifice anything to be a vegan. And it's like it's not
yeah.
true.
For most people, it's not.
To be a vegan, you have to be awkward at dinner
Mm-hmm.
parties. You have to, if people want to go out for dinner, you have to be like, oh, I can't go there, I can't go here. You've got to be different. It's just you've got to stand out from the crowd.
Yeah,
You've got to be teased by people. And for people like us, we're like, the 1% of the population or however many that are fine with that. Like,
mm-hmm.
because for whatever reason we place the issue and like as more important, and we're willing to take that social cost. Um, but for most people just want a quiet life. They want to sit and be in the crowd. And even for me, like when I first went vegan, I was a lot more like, yeah, I'm a vegan.
Mm-hmm.
Now, like I go through life. I'm 10 years in. I most of the time, if I can avoid mentioning it, I do because I want to live a peaceful life,
Yeah,
um, and like we really need to understand that it is hard to be different. Um, and so the lack of uptake into veganism and vegetarianism and things like that isn't isn't an indicator in terms of how much support we have.
yeah,
I think it's an indicator of how many people there are who are willing to put like living with integrity, like moral integrity, as like the cornerstone principle of their life.
yep. I agree.
Because I think like most people like put family at the center of their life, not morality.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so to me, that's all it really the number of vegans is an indicator of. Um, but yeah, in terms of I always analyze this situation as as a collective action problem.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's like there's a sense of like there's a lot of people that if we were all to go to vegan together would be like, yeah, I'll go vegan together. Um, and it's how you get to that space. Like I remember there's this is actually another like Roger Hallam thing. He kind of talks about the collective action problem in terms of like if you're organizing a football match
Mm-hmm.
and you're organizing 11 aside and you need 22 people there, and if you invite one person and say, look, I'm organizing a football match, do you want to come? They'll kind of hedge a bit and they'll be like, oh yeah, yeah, I could come on Saturday, yeah, but they're not going to commit because they're currently the only person committing.
Mm-hmm.
But once you're on like number 15 or whatever, people be
Yeah,
like, oh yeah,
yeah.
okay, I'm definitely going to be there. Um, and and so you have to get enough people conditionally on board for then the big shift to happen.
Yeah.
So that's what I see the job of. It's we need to get as many people conditionally on board, and then you then need the opportunity of, like, you need the game day on Saturday, and then all of a sudden people will be there.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Are you aware of the Solomon Asch conformity experiments? Have you heard of this?
No.
So there's a scholar at Harvard who did some of the early experiments on conformity and collective action. And he was doing these experiments where there was a group of people and they're all showed a couple lines and they're told, now this is really simple task. All you have to do is figure out which line's longer. And it's just kind of obvious. There's like a long line and a short line. And they just say, can you just remember which line is the short line? All right. I'm going to ask you later which line, just look at the lines. And, basically 100% of people get this right when they're acting on their own. All right. But then when you put people in a group, right, and you got a group, and the experimenters didn't tell the person they're actually performing the experiment on, they're a bunch of plants. They're trying to test whether people are willing to be dissonants and be different, even when they're 100% sure they're right. And they'd have a bunch of people say, say B is the shorter line. They'd all just say A. Yeah, I remember A is the shorter line. And it is astonishing. I think it was 80% of people just go along with the group, right? Even though they saw with their own eyes, this is wrong. But the really interesting thing about this experiment is you can basically cure the conformity completely if you just have one other person willing to stand up and say, like, no, you guys are all wrong. I mean, like, you can have 100 people say before the last person that, the wrong line is the shorter line. And if you get even one or two people to give that person a little backup, then suddenly they feel like, all right, it's not just me. There's collective action. And I can be the one to stick out. And I'm not just isolated and alone and saying what I know is true is true. And the same thing has been shown even in disturbing context involving violence or even self-harm, where someone will harm themselves, because this is just one of the fundamental things that Roger Hallam points us out a lot too, that human beings are just very conformist animals. We have to think about the relational and social aspect of the human condition if we want to understand how to create change. It's not fundamentally about what one person thinks. It's about how the collective thinks. It's about the relationships we have to each other. And this is one of the powers of direct action. When you have people collectively engaging in some sort of direct action, like all their friends and family members, they want to know, all these people in their lives. And even if you don't know the specific person who's doing some sort of civil disobedience, even if you can imagine yourself, even if you hear about that biography and you hear, oh, this is someone who was a law student at London School of Economics or wherever, and is someone into meditation, and maybe that fits my demographic category, I can relate to their experience in some way. And that's a huge part of why we create change. It's not even in the message itself. It's kind of in a relational openness that happens because we figured out how to solve that collective action problem and just get people to actually think about what they themselves truly believe. And when they do, they realize what I think most of us from a common sense perspective realize, which is there isn't really a moral difference between a dog and a pig. And not to say that dogs aren't tortured in this country, but it is just a logical and legal absurdity the way we brutalize pigs in ways that we don't brutalize dogs for the most part. I mean, there are exceptions in labs, but yeah, so a huge part of what we're trying to do is just create that potential energy to get a collective of people to come out together and say, okay, let's at least think about this and see what we decide if we do think about this. And this is the genius of what you all have done for the last few years. You've gotten so many people to think about this and mobilize so many people to support the activism and the movement as a result. So 2 questions I want to ask that, because before I forget. One is, how the hell did you get 16 animal rights groups in the room to even talk about systemic change and direct action?
Before I answer that, I'm going to go. There's something I wanted to say on what you were saying before. Okay. And so there's on this. You're saying about the one person stepping up, and that's enough to make, like, it's what I kind of feel is it's so incredibly subtle, the things that you can do to increase the likelihood of participation. And like this is when I was like very junior activist, and I was doing, where you stand up showing the footage, and we used to go onto trains and we'd stand on the front of the train carriage and show it to the whole carriage. And most people, if you stand there, they look away, they don't pay attention. And then we did an experiment where we'd put someone as a plant in the carriage. And all they had to do, and this is the role I played, and so I had to watch this footage over and over again. all I had to do was like lean forward and a very small lean forward and look like I'm
You're looking at
connecting and I'm caring. Stuff is so subtle.
yeah,
And then if you did that, the entire carriage would watch, even the people who are in front of
yeah,
me and aren't aware that there's a guy behind
yeah,
doing it. And like, and that's all it, and so you'd do that, and then you'd have loads of people taking the flyers because I'd be the first one to grab a flyer and all this kind of stuff. But it's yeah,
yeah.
it was like it was micro movements. It wasn't like a
Yeah.
dramatic like, oh my god, hey guys, have you seen this? But it was
This happened to me
yeah,
yesterday on
so
the street. Except I was
oh
the
yeah.
one because I saw there were a couple people just looking up at the sky behind me, and then I started looking at the sky, and none of it. There was
yeah.
nothing there, and literally
Yeah.
everyone on the street started looking up behind us, and we're just like, "What's there?"
Mm,
You're right. There's
mm,
there's this subtle social cue that we all are
yeah.
looking for at all times, even when we're not even consciously aware of it, and that's such a genius example of it.
Yeah, and it's sort of like micro designing
Mhm.
your actions and your campaigns. It's like you need to design in those details because the difference between success and failure.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay. How to get the animal rights orgs into a room. So the it was an interesting starting of Animal Rebellion actually because I'd been bouncing around the idea of like maybe should set up this thing, and then there was the woman called Dora who is co-founder of Animal Rebellion along with me, and she had gone to uh, actually again Roger. She'd gone to Roger's birthday party and said, you know what, we should do an animal rights version of Extinction Rebellion, and we can
Mm.
work together. And then Roger was like, you should speak to Dan. And so then on the Tuesday evening, me and Dora had a call, and I was like, and we kind of talked it through, and I was like, yeah, I've kind of been thinking about this. If we do it, I'd say like this is the plan and this is the strategy that we should do. And then on the Friday, we were going to be like, yeah, okay, we'll meet again. So we had a 3 day gap between the Tuesday and the Friday. And there was a third person in this meeting who I'm not allowed to say who it was because they don't want, because they're quite well connected in the movement and they don't like to be associated with the civil disobedience stuff.
Hmm.
But they said to me, oh, could I invite a few other people along to this meeting?
Hmm.
And I was like, yeah, if they're cool, you know, bring them along because we're just bouncing around ideas here. It's fine.
Yeah.
And then, and so then for this next Zoom call that we're having on the Friday, he said, oh yeah, I've invited Earthling Ed and like uh, someone from Viva and Animal Equality and all of these different organizations. Like Matthew Glover, I think, was on the call and all of these things. And he sent me that email on I think like the Thursday morning or the Wednesday night or something. And I was like, oh fuck. If we're going to be talking to all of these people, we need a plan. We can't just be bouncing around ideas.
Yeah.
Can't talk to everyone like this without a plan. So then I spent Thursday I wrote a 25-page document of
Wow.
like this is what Animal Rebellion is. This is how we're going to mobilize it. This is the narrative. Plant-based food systems. Da 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 da.
Yeah.
And then we presented that on the Friday. But the reason why everyone came along to that meeting, and that was the first like cross-organizational one, and then we had an in-person and then another in-person. We were riding the wave of Extinction Rebellion.
Mhm.
It was one of those things of like the Animal Rebellion was able to come into being because people were craving it. All it was is like, and I was being carried by the wave. I wasn't creating the wave. I was just keeping up with it and doing
Mhm.
the best that I could. And yeah, because Extinction Rebellion had just had their big April 2019 rebellion, and then
Mhm.
they were just like the best thing. Everyone were just like, wow,
Yeah.
that just
You got to
happened.
learn about this.
So so when the idea was like animal rights going in to connect with that, everyone was just like, yes. And
Wow.
so
Okay.
it was pure luck.
Wow.
It was
Yeah.
pure luck. It was a right place, right time thing. And again, like in terms of, I was lucky to be uniquely placed to be able to create Animal Rebellion. You know, like I knew the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion, so we could negotiate a way to be in solidarity with each other.
Yeah.
We'd been, you know, studying this stuff together for years, so we shared the same theory of change. So and then I was also connected in with the animal rights world. So it was like it was just the stars just magically aligned for it to come into being. And like I say, it wasn't planned for.
Hmm.
And I had to do this big pivot in my life, and just all of a sudden,
Yeah.
I was quitting my job like a few weeks later and moving to London and all of these things. And
Wow.
yeah,
Yeah, it's weird because Extinction Rebellion did have a huge impact in the United States, and Sunrise had a big impact. I don't even know if there's a Sunrise movement in the UK, but
No.
they're the group that did the sit-in in Dianne Feinstein. There's a very famous senator in California who is a
Mm.
liberal, progressive, but has consistently opposed more dramatic change and climate change. And it was a bunch of kids. It was kind of inspired by Greta. A bunch of kids just did this
Mm.
sit-in in her office and got a lot of national media attention. Um, but for whatever reason, the United States, none of the animal rights groups have ever really shown much interest, and I
Mm.
don't quite know why. And it's interesting that that was the genesis of the the kind of meeting of the minds. There are people in some of the big organizations I'm friendly with, and I talk to, and I try to be friendly with everybody, but I don't know if it's because there is more of just an institutional animal rights movement in the United States and a lot of countries.
Mm.
So the Humane Society, which I love in so many ways, but this is a $400 million organization that has enormous amount of influence and tendrils in every single state and every single legislature, and affects the movement in very, very fundamental ways. Um,
Mm.
or if it's just something about the culture of our movement in the United States. But not only has there not been much collaboration on direct action, it also, but most of the mainstream groups have actively tried to destroy us, which is kind of
Mm.
sad. I think I can say this openly, but and because the new leadership is not like this at all. But Mercy for Animals, for example, they had a very significant leader named Nick Cooney, who
Mm.
basically used to go around telling everyone we need to stop direct action ever. Not only like I don't think this
Mm.
tactic is effective, or I don't want to be involved in it, or we should be actively organizing to try and stop them. I heard through
Mm.
the grapevine that there are certain key donor conversations happening in the United States where people were actively thinking about funding organizations to destroy us. Um,
Oh wow.
there was, yeah, and I don't know. And actually, I will say one of the people who came out, because I know this guy, Peter Singer, was one of the people who
Mm.
came out and said, "Are you guys out of your mind? Like, what? You can have strategic disagreements and not try to destroy this group.
Mm.
Just go talk to them." I mean, and I will say a lot of the important figures in the animal welfare space, like Lewis Bollard, is someone I
Mm.
really respect and admire. Josh Balk, who's the farm animal director at HSUS. It was often people are very influential, but like a little step removed away from the activism, who really wanted to destroy us. Um, but
Yeah.
there's another figure in the movement who's a very prominent animal welfare supporter, a very prominent leader of a major animal rights organization, who even wrote a blog publicly saying he was convinced that I personally was an infiltrator working for the meat industry. Yeah,
Wow.
so my
So
experience with
so
trying to create unity in the movement has been very different from yours. And again, it might just be my personality. Maybe I'm just an asshole. I can't figure out how like for people, but it has been honestly one of the most discouraging things to me over the last 10 years is the efforts within the animal rights movement to
mm,
destroy our work, and it
i-
takes so much
is
of
there
my
any
time.
reflections in terms of why that came about? Have you taken any learnings of what could have been
Yeah.
done differently?
So a couple things. One is I think I probably wrote in a fashion that was too adversarial towards the rest of the movement in the early days.
Mm.
And the best example of this is this thing I wrote in 2007, a long time ago, called Boycott Veganism, which is
Mm. It was a great article. I read it. Mm.
you're one of the
I
few.
loved it.
No, but it, the problem with it is it's 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 an extremely ironic article because it points to a
Yeah.
problem in the vegan movement, which is like a bunch of vegans having this self-righteousness towards non-vegans, and just thinking we're better
Mm.
than them because we're vegan, when there's a lot more we
Mm.
could do. Just because you're vegan doesn't mean you're helping animals, and and even if you are helping animals by being vegan, there's a lot more you could do. And so you're not really
Mm.
morally in a different position than the non-vegans, right? But the tone I
Mm.
took in that article had the same contempt towards not just vegans, but
Mm.
people interested in individual vegan advocacy, as I was condemning
Yeah.
within the vegan movement. In other words, I was saying, vegans, you're being so fucking self righteous while being self righteous myself. Like I was being,
Mm.
except just self righteous towards vegans instead of, so I was
Mm.
replicating the same problem. This goes back to what we said about Mao and Lenin. You can't, if you're trying to challenge his
Mm.
attitude, you cannot have that same attitude yourself. And that's the attitude I had.
Yeah.
And I think I think just I think partly because of that article, I had this reputation of being a smartass in the movement. That this guy
Mm,
just thinks he's better than everybody. He thinks he's smarter than everybody. He's a piece of shit. Um,
mm,
but also, another reason is like I had never even been to an animal rights conference before Direct Action Everywhere. I didn't care at all about
yeah.
relationships. I
Mm,
completely neglected that it's not just ideas, it's relationships that build power and movements. And so
yeah.
for years, I started developing these ideas, and I had a couple relationships. I had people like Josh and my friend Lauren, who are leaders in the Shack campaign.
Mm,
I talked to, but I didn't think about building a network or hearing other people's
mm,
perspectives on this. I just argued with people on the internet all day. That's like what I did,
mm.
and I felt like I won a lot of the arguments, but they also ended with me being banned. I was banned from like all the vegan forums in the mid 2000s. So a lot of it
Yeah,
might just be
interesting.
just associations, but I don't think it's just about me, because honestly, not that many people read Boycott Veganism, and the people who did read Boycott
Mm,
Veganism didn't even know I wrote it because it didn't have an author on it. It was
mm,
just circulated. Um, so I think another reason it went so badly is um, I think that one of this goes back to what I was saying about thinking about internal strategy as much as external strategy. One of the
mm,
reasons people ended up kind of hating so much of what DXE was doing and hating me specifically was because we didn't have a good internal strategy for deciding who's going to be our spokesperson. How do we resolve
mm,
conflicts? And so a lot, and how do we decide which actions are being elevated or defining what our movement is going to do? Because I had this extremely anarchistic philosophy of activism, and it's
mm.
really ironic because everyone thinks DXE is a cult, but if you actually came to one of our organizing meetings, you'd see how wild it was, and just how there were so many things happening that I did not want to happen, including some of the
Yeah,
most
yeah,
famous
yeah.
actions in DXE history. There were just things I was like,
Mm.
please do not do this. And they did it anyway. So an example of this is all the disruptions of Bernie Sanders. I was constantly so irritated and trying to convince people, please do not do this. And you'll note
Oh, that's
that I am not at
interesting.
any of them.
Mm,
I am not at a single disruption of Bernie
mm,
Sanders because I hated them so much. And I kept trying to convince
mm,
people. But, and I'm, in many ways, that's beautiful because it's great that people are able to do these things,
mm,
even though the co-founder of the organization is like arguing vehemently, please do not do this. And they do it anyways.
mm,
But, the problem with that too is that a lot of times the worst elements of the movement end up being what's represented. So the person
yeah.
who all the mainstream animal rights organizations see as representative of your organization is the person who says
Mm,
welfareists deserve to die. It's like, I don't think that,
yeah.
and I don't believe that. But we didn't even really have a mechanism for sorting out, well, what does DXE stand for?
Mm,
Who represents
mm,
us? And and I probably should have taken a stronger role as a leader in shaping the messaging and saying, look, if people are saying welfareists deserve to die, that's not okay. That's not what we stand for. We're trying to be
mm,
collaborative. But I just didn't have leadership experience and wasn't sure what to do with it. And was like, all right, I
mm,
mean, I guess people are saying welfareists deserve to die. What am I supposed to do about this? It's just some random person on the internet.
mm,
And I didn't understand
mm,
how the worst elements of your movement, and the person saying that might not even be a bad person. They're just a little wild.
mm,
They haven't gone through
yeah.
nonviolence training. They don't really understand, or maybe they have, and they're just dispositionally not well suited to be a spokesperson for the movement. But that's the person everyone remembers. They remember that
Yeah.
comment. Um, so I remember, like, around the time we started doing a lot of our campaigning against these animal welfare campaigns, a lot of groups were working with exactly the companies we're protesting against and investigating to promote vegan
Mm.
products. And there's uh, there was an organization, I don't even want to say which organization it was, that was celebrating the fact that Chipotle, do you guys have Chipotle in the UK? It's like a burrito
We have
place.
a couple.
Okay. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
a
yeah, yeah. We
huge,
have a few.
it's like a huge, it's like a pretty dominant chain in the United States. It basically created
Mm,
this category of fast food restaurants called fast casual that are, you know,
mm,
they're fast food, but they're nicer than normal fast food. And it's all Mexican food. But they announced this product called Sofritas, which is basically a vegan protein. And a lot of the mainstream groups are just going wild over this, celebrating this. And at the same time, we're investigating Chipotle for lying about their use of animals.
mm,
And one of the groups had been working with Chipotle and getting Sofritas announced, and they had this big victory saying you were announcing Sofritas, and they post this on their Facebook page. and their page just gets overwhelmed by our supporters, like shouting at them, telling them they're scum. How dare you work at Chipotle? And I did nothing about it, or at least I might have written something internally and said like, hey, maybe we should calm this down. And I will say, the worst part about this wasn't just that I did nothing about it. There was part of me that was like, yeah, I'm kind of glad this is happening. I mean, I didn't, I don't know. Did I feel that way? I'd have to go back in time and ask myself. I definitely didn't intervene the way I would do now. And so I think that was a huge mistake. There were specific examples like that were mistakes, but the bigger mistake was just not even figuring out how to create a culture and a governance and a strategy that when stuff like that happened, it's kind of what you were saying about just spontaneously, everyone's drilling tires. Was this a good idea? Who knows? But it's happening. What are we going to do about it? Yeah. But I hadn't thought about, all right, what happens in that sort of situation? And obviously, I think your situation is probably a more strategically important example of that than all these DXC people yelling at another organization about Chipotle. But it was a sort of thing that we hadn't thought about, and it was just happening. And it made a lot of animal rights activists, even to this day. I mean, I can't even speak at most of the animal rights conferences. It's really weird that, I
even now
it's changing now. I mean, because partly because of just we've had such huge victories over the last 4 years, and just with these verdicts, I think people are like, all right, I guess we have to let them speak. But there's still people who hate me. So I organized last week a meeting of just local animal rights groups, and it's funny, someone who I'm actually pretty friendly with on a personal level, and I won't say who it was. It was kind of like the meeting you were describing, but not as many organizations. It was like 8 organizations that got together, actually in a space. It was just in a conference room right around the corner. And I started the meeting by saying, like, I want this to be a space where we invite collaborative people. And immediately someone raises their hand and says, but how do we know if they're collaborative? Because for the last 10 years, I would have been convinced until this meeting, actually, that you are not a very collaborative person, and you're exactly the sort of person we need to exclude from the movement. And I was like, that's interesting. I don't know. I mean, you've been kind of an outside observer of a lot of this in the United States. I don't know how much you followed the journeys of DXC. A lot of it is just straight up disinformation too. Like the cult allegations and the sexual misconduct allegations have done a lot of damage too, because Me Too in the United States was such a big deal. And when people started accusing us, it's really funny because the Me Too stuff was something we actually did take seriously way before it became a serious issue. Like, we had accountability mechanisms, and I could tell you some crazy stories about like me trying to represent women as a lawyer who are accusing men in the movement of various forms of sexual harassment years before Me Too, and just being destroyed by the movement for it. Like, the movement was not receptive to people advocating for these things. So to a certain extent, we were inoculated against that because most of the people internally knew that we actually were trying to take these issues seriously. But that really affected things deeply too. I don't know if it affected the UK movement. The US movement, it not just for us, but for all the organizations, collaboration died a lot because everyone was just scared.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, it's well, I think there's so a lot of these things are tied up together, I guess. Like on the so I just want to kind of like relate. So the relationship side, I think I was really lucky because mentorship has been a big part of my journey, and one of the mentors that I had was Mark Westcombe, and this was around the time that we were building up Animal Rebellion, and one of the things that he said to me is, you need to if you're coming out with something very new and controversial, and it's a very different theory of change, you need to get that in front of people in the movement first. So that meeting was lucky that it got organized, but we would have tried to organize it anyway to try and bring everyone together. And we'd already been doing a lot of relationship building because we were already beginning to work with this different theory of change. So the advice there from Mark of like, before you come out, they need to get the chance to chew it over and think it through. And then he said to me, all you need to do, you don't need to get them to support you. You don't need to win them round. That's, it's almost like an impossible task to convince an organization that's got an established theory of change to change it. So that was never really the objective of changing other people's theory of change. The only objective was for them not to talk badly about you publicly. So they need to understand you enough. They need to like you enough. They need to see that you're on the same side, just so that they don't bash you publicly. So all of the relationship building we did in those early days was just from that point of view. Um, and that was one of the most important lessons I think I ever learned, and it still stands true today. And like, when we have groups setting up university campaigns calling for 100% plant-based transition, that advice goes to the groups and says, get everyone who's currently working on this issue and go and talk to them before you launch.
Yeah.
And the groups that haven't done it get themselves in a real bind, because the problem is if somebody sees it and then they reactively, say, post something on social media or says something in a public forum that's against you, then not only have they got this opinion and formed this opinion, but also their ego is attached to that opinion because they've said it publicly. Yeah. So it's like, how do they then step back?
Yeah.
So the private interaction is really, really important. So I think that was like one of the things that I saw. Yeah, maybe DXC didn't do so well, and I think Mark also,
that's being charitable that we didn't do it so well. we were terrible about that. No, we might still be terrible about that, but it's a good point.
But I forget it as well sometimes, because I'm maybe we're quite similar in that, like, the more relational work, because it's not like my forte. I'm not the most relational person. I'm more just someone who likes to figure out ideas and really just think that I'm right. And the idea of going around and talking to people and making friends is like, it's just not what I'm oriented towards at all. So I've had to kind of continually force myself into spaces of getting to know people. And I do think that, even though, like, at the time I was very supportive of that boycott veganism article because I did really align with it, that lesson of not trying to change other organizations, and not trying, it's just and this is I think another thing that I learned from Mark, and just lucky to have that insight and that guidance at the time, which is, what all you need to do is you do your thing and you keep doing your thing. And maybe at some point, people kind of come round, or at least they just accept you as being part of the club. But you don't win by persuading people. It's not this like rationalist enterprise.
Yeah, it's just about the relationship. No, Mark has a lot of wisdom.
Yeah. He does have a lot of wisdom.
Mark, it's very funny. I met Mark in 2018, I think it was, at the Animal Liberation Conference, and I still remember the conversation I had with him, because he was one of the ones. I was sitting in my kitchen with him, just having a conversation. He said to me, you're about to have an internal explosion. And he basically predicted a lot what was going to happen in terms of the infighting within the movement, because he had been talking to people at the conference, and I just didn't believe him. I was like, no, everyone's fine. We have little tiffs within the movement. People disagree about stuff, but things are fine. They do their thing, we do our thing. And he said, no, you need to, like, figure this out and start talking to some people, even internal to DXC, because and I just didn't believe him. I just thought, he's just like this older guy who's being conservative. Just I got to focus on my thing. I don't want to do all this relational stuff and figure out what's going on. And I'm also genuine. I'm generally a pretty naive person, just about. It's one of my greatest strengths, and almost also one of my greatest weaknesses is I'm very trusting of everyone. Like, I just trust people, which is why security culture is hard for me, because I want to tell everyone everything, because I just trust everyone. And that's one of the reasons I find your style so appealing, because I hate the idea of like not telling people things. Just tell people everything. But I'm sitting in my kitchen, and Mark is like, I think he even just like put his hand on my shoulder and said, like, Wayne, you need to start thinking about this, because I'm telling you right now, there's all these bubbles. He might not have used that word, but I remember thinking and visualizing it that way. There are all these little bubbles popping up, and it's about to cause this massive internal conflict that's going to impede your progress for animals. And so you have to start thinking about this internal relational stuff. I think it was just a couple months later, there was a huge explosion, and I was like, whoa, I did not expect that. And Mark was completely right.
Yeah, so, and these are the part of the roles of leadership, isn't it? Of taking responsibility for the culture of the group, of the governance structures, and stepping in and like there's a lot of it surprised me because I was similar to you. Is I kind of my history, I was very anarchist oriented. I
Hmm.
was an anarchist. I would identify, and I still, I guess, am anarchist informed now, but I'm certainly don't identify as such because seeing seeing the role and the massive importance of leadership, um, within both Animal Rising and other organizations that I've been a part of or have witnessed, it's like it's so crucial to have someone who's holding the vision of who this group is, who's narrating it, who's defining the culture, and it requires like constant intervention
Hmm.
and also like often intervention in the small things, like when things are like the seed of an idea is emerging that is conflicting with actually like the theory of change that you're working with or so on, because it's like once those seeds get hold, it's like, yeah, like what we were saying before, it builds and it escalates.
Yeah.
um and like an example of where I often see groups really stumble on this is like around just kind of like radical left purity politics
Yes.
and like infighting. And it's like because when that takes hold in your movement, it just runs absolutely wild and leads to all kinds of implosions and self-destruct mechanisms and all kind of things. And it's like, but it emerges in the smallest of interactions.
Hmm.
um, and so it requires a high degree of vigilance. And the same is with security culture. Security culture comes in with just like someone choosing to adopt a code name one day, and then someone goes, "Oh, maybe I'll adopt a code name too." And you've got to be like, "No, no code names, no code names. This is
And then,
this
yeah,
isn't because it's
yeah, it devolves into the point that we don't even know
yeah,
each other's names.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
I don't even know
yeah."
who the hell you
And then
are.
and it opens the door, and like suddenly it's just like you a week later of code names, and there's like about 5 or 6 other security culture practices have made its way in, and
Yeah.
it's like, and it it does take a lot, and it and then it also needs to be done with like in a friendly way, in a
Hmm.
non controlling and
Yeah.
inclusive manner, so that people so it's a really really hard art of leadership
Yeah, it
actually.
is. I
And
agree. And so much harder
but
in the
yeah,
grassroots than
crucial.
in another context. If you're part of the
So much
traditional
harder.
501(c)(3), it's easier. I
Yeah.
was a boss to people in the corporate world as a lawyer, and that's so much easier
Mm,
because the lines are so clean, and also people don't actually care that much. So the fact that people care is
mm,
obviously a huge opportunity for the movement, but it's also a peril because then when things don't go their way, it fundamentally harms their identity in ways that if they don't
mm,
go that way at work when you're just a stupid lawyer for some dumb big company, no one gives a
mm,
shit. But people give a shit
mm,
when things don't go their way in the grassroots, even more than in a
mm,
501(c)(3). Because I know have so many friends that work at nonprofits and they're like, whatever, I don't care. I mean, it's a job, and I'm glad I can work for the animals, but I don't feel embedded in the mission. So the very thing that makes the grassroots so powerful, which is that people are deeply connected to the identity of our work and the mission and the values of our work, becomes this huge
mm,
obstacle when we can't figure out what to do about a disagreement or a deviation. But one thing about
mm,
security culture, and I've told you before, and I might actually try and force you to do this because I think it's important. I think you should write about this. I think
mm,
someone needs to write about this because when you said this to me on a call, and it honestly it had been percolating. It was like one of those instances where it was an obviously at least compelling and probably right idea that I hadn't thought about
mm,
very much recently, and I could see all the ways I was not thinking about it and
mm,
making probably bad decisions. And I also just think people should write in general more smart stuff in animal rights because there
mm.
isn't a lot of smart written content. But have you heard about the in the Gaza protests, all the masks everyone's wearing and their approach to security culture? It is wild.
No.
Yeah. So all these Gaza protesters, they all wear these masks. They refuse to.
Oh
They
no.
refuse to give their names to anyone. They don't talk to the
Yep.
media. It's like,
Mm,
with some exceptions, they'll have one anointed person talk to the media, but it's such a reclusive culture, and
yeah,
and
yeah,
it's
yeah.
it's mind-blowing to me that you have this incredible opportunity to show the world that you're just like ordinary people, that you have a message that ordinary people will understand and appreciate. Because who can be against bombing children? I mean, 13,000 children have
Yeah.
been killed, and
Mm,
yet they're so scared and have been so shaped by the
mm,
security culture of the left that they won't even
yeah.
show their face. They won't
Mm,
even tell people what their name is. And I can kind of
mm,
get that because, in the context of the Gaza protests, there's all this doxing of people as anti-Semites. So
yeah.
like there have been these vans, but you know, that's part of activism. The scrutiny
Yeah.
that's imposed on you, if you're going to be an activist, and frankly, if you're doing things that are defensible, when people accuse you of
Mm,
anti-Semitism and they dox you, you should be able
mm,
to. I mean, again, not that it's easy to do this always, because certainly people paint animal rights
mm,
activists in a very negative way all the time too. That's not true, but
mm,
that is an opportunity for you to tell the world what your actual message is. And so,
yeah.
while the animal agriculture industry is trying to paint us as terrorists, and they have doxed me, probably more than anyone in the animal rights movement in modern times, that has actually been good for us, because when they say all these
Mm,
nasty things about me, that he's a terrorist, he's a criminal, we've actually harnessed that for positive purposes because
mm,
we actually are willing to stand behind our words and our actions. And so, if you
yeah.
have
Yeah. Yeah.
integrity in
Yeah.
your actual actions, if someone comes to you and accuses you of being an anti-Semite, you say, like, how can it be anti-Semitic to say I don't want a child to die? Well, if you've
Mm,
been saying
mm,
things like, there was a leader of the Columbia protests who was saying things like every Zionist deserves to die and I'm going to murder them myself.
mm.
Well, the problem is not you're being doxxed. The problem is you're saying dumb shit like that you should not be saying.
Yeah. Yeah.
And not just you're
Yeah.
saying
Yeah.
that, but
Yeah.
your leaders are saying that. Even your leaders are saying
Yeah.
these terrible things that are completely violent,
Mm,
unacceptable. And so just get your messaging, your values right. And then, yeah. So I'm just like, I think you've kind of changed my mind about this in very fundamental ways.
mm,
And I can see how security culture has creeped into my organizing over the last 5 years after all these prosecutions. And you need to write
mm.
about this, Dan, because I think it's an important idea.
Yeah, because it's so subtle. It's like because it's what is the energy that gets put across, isn't
Yeah.
it? If you see someone in a mask, it's like, is that inviting?
Yeah.
It's like, if there's like a mum with her kid, does she want to go and rock up to that protest to go hang out with a bunch of people in masks? It's like, no, she doesn't. And it's like you have to go. You're doing stuff that's so countercultural, that's so antagonistic, that's so oppositional. You have to do everything that you can
Yeah.
to welcome people. And if anything, what security culture does, yeah, it either alienates people, it creates barriers for entry for people to come and join your movement because they've got to download some strange phone app that they
Mhm.
don't already have on their phone, or they, yeah, need to feel like they have to adopt a code name, or they have to be careful what they
Say,
say
yeah.
because some information gets heard, some doesn't, and then even that, like you have you feel less safe within the
Yeah.
space because you feel like you have to watch what you say. So
Yep.
that level of discomfort that you feel, maybe that contributes like a 10% to your likelihood of not returning again.
Yeah.
And it's like all of these different things. It's like your whole culture. If the job is mass movement organizing, which it seems like what the Gaza protests are, every part of your culture needs to be engineered towards that.
Yeah.
And so me hearing that says, like, this Gaza process is going to come and it's going to go,
Yeah.
which is a shame because, if there was some of these lessons built in, then they'll have this wave and then they could have another wave, building on this power. But it seems like they're probably going to collapse under it. But also, like you say, like I empathize with why people do security culture. Like within like the animal rights movement in the UK and the climate movement, a lot of the security culture comes from people in the 90s and in the 2000s who experienced like really heavy police repression.
Hmm.
Like, there was one guy who I met who used to lead the live export protests. He had the police coming to his house on a weekly basis and they would raid his house. They would take TVs off the wall and take them away. They would hammer holes in the wall. Like, and every week just harassing him doing this, claiming that they're searching for some evidence about something that happened or other. Um, and that his wife had a mental breakdown and like all of these things, and then he ended up being unjustly imprisoned for like 6 months on trumped up charges that had no way of standing up in court. But like the psychological trauma of that is real, as well as like the infiltration. And I don't know if you've like if this news made its way over to the UK, but like animal rights protesters had married undercover police officers.
Mhm.
Some I think had children
Yeah, I heard about this.
with undercover police officers. Yeah, and like so the movements as a result, yeah, did a massive like contraction and looking inwards and said, right, we're going to limit who can come and join us. We're going to be very careful about it. But like, so it's a natural response, but it's a reaction. It's not an intentional choice. It's like bad stuff's happened. Okay, we close. But really, it's like the difference between reactivity and responsiveness. It's like if you respond by opening up entirely, then you can actually achieve your objective, and you can actually counter a lot of the issues that can arise within these spaces. You run a risk by doing it, but so much more goodness can flow in from just the beauty of the people that join, your ability to organize this amazing, crazy stuff because you've got so many people participating beyond just like your tiny little actions here and there. Yeah, the psychological safety that people can build, the relationships that people can build, the diversity, like the old grannies that can come and join because they're not being, all of this kind of stuff.
They're not being told you've got a signal, we can't talk to you.
Yeah. Like, what's an old granny going to do with that? Like,
I've actually talked to a lot of old grannies. They're like, "What signal?" It's like, I don't have an iPhone. It's like, oh, I mean, poor granny. She doesn't even have an iPhone. How's she going to get her signal? You're right.
Yeah. Grannies need to participate too.
Exactly. Yeah, this is honestly blowing my mind a little bit because I've actually. So one of my worst attributes right now, which used to be one of my best attributes, is I've become much less trusting of other activists. And there are a variety of reasons for that. I've been stabbed in the back many times, and it's just been kind of, maybe stabbed in the back is too strong. Actually, no, it's not too strong. There definitely have been instances where I think the people who stabbed me in the back have conceded. I've stabbed you in the back, and I'm sorry for that. I've actually heard this a couple of years ago from someone who took away all of DXC's Twitter accounts, and like someone on our tech team who just decided, I'm going to like steal all their accounts and give them to people who hate them. And he actually reached out a couple of years ago and said, like, can you tell Wayne I'm sorry I stabbed him in the back? And I was like, oh, that's actually pretty sign of growth. That's actually pretty impressive to acknowledge that. But one of the subtle ways I think all the security culture and confidentiality stuff has affected me over the years, especially after the government started coming after us, is I just become a much less trusting person. And and sometimes it's not even about what you think or who you are, what you believe. What you do affects your identity in important ways beyond what you actually think. And if you're constantly worried about who knows what you're doing, almost by definition, you become a less trusting person. And we know from enormous amount of sociological literature and that trust is really important in movements, especially in high stakes work, right? The more high stakes it is, the more you have to trust people. And if you're constantly worried that I'm giving information to someone I can't trust, I mean, the hard thing is just when your trust is broken, it's really hard to continue doing it the way you're right. There's this reactivity that you have an episode of distrust. So I mean, like, do you feel like your trust has been broken? Like, how do you continue to maintain openness when, or maybe your trust hasn't been broken, but
my trust has been broken, but I was blindsided because my trust was broken in different ways than I didn't expect, and so I had it on like more personal levels. My trust getting broken, and this was kind of like a few years into me kind of really deep into this movement building, and so it really affected how I organized, but it was for different reasons. Like, and I noticed how I would relate to people and how people would relate to me. Like, it impacted my ability to organize volunteers, to get people to take action. Massively dropped my own confidence and my own willingness to be able to step in and to be doing things. And like, and it was a very disempowering process.
Wow.
And I had to do a lot of agonizing, like self, like development work to learn to
Overcome
trust
that.
again.
Wow.
Yeah, and yeah, and but in terms of like from an organizing point of view,
Yeah.
um, the security culture. Yeah, we've had breaches of trust within our movement. We've had, yeah, like there's this new thing of just undercover journalists coming in
Hmm.
and revealing our plans and all this kind of stuff. And but I think for me, like my theoretical foundation has been so firmly strong around the security culture stuff.
Mm.
It's never had like a real personal impact on me in terms of like, say, a friend who then I discover isn't really. I've never had that happen.
Hmm.
Um, So who knows when I encounter something like that, which probably will happen one day. But we've experienced it in the movement. But the theoretical foundation has been strong enough that I've always been able to
Yeah.
advocate within our culture to hold the line. And I always just rely very much on this quote that I heard Paul Engler saying, like he has these. You've probably seen the Momentum
Hmm.
webinars, the famous Amy Momentum
Hmm.
webinars. Um, and he talks about an organizer called Lisa Fithian, who starts every meeting like where there's a lot of people present. It's like if there are any police officers or if there are any journalists in the room, you're welcome. Please come. You know, you're just the welcoming space. You'll see how nice everyone is, and please join. And please join the fundraising team because nobody ever wants to do fundraising, so that'll be a really good place for you. And
That's
it's
great.
and you bring the lightness in,
Sure.
and so I've nicked it. I use that at
That's
times.
great.
I just nick the same joke because yeah, and it what's the best way to dispel fear? It's through humor, isn't
Yeah.
it?
And I will say that's been
Yeah,
incredibly powerful in our trials to the extent, and we haven't been nearly as open as you, but one of the things that's really influenced the juries when they have acquitted us is this sense of openness that, we
yeah,
don't hide what we're doing and they're being very transparent about everything. And look, they just look like such
mm,
friendly people. And it's even affected the prosecutors and police who've investigated us. So
mm,
when I was disbarred provisionally, I got suspended again, so they took my license away again this time. It might be permanent this time. But the first time around when they took my license away, the prosecutor who convicted me of felony in North Carolina actually wrote me a letter of support because
mm,
when he learned more about us and he saw how open and just nice and friendly we were, he was like, "Well, I mean, now I kind of feel bad. I just I just took this guy's license
mm,
away and he
mm,
got convicted of felony. I don't want
mm,
that to happen. He seems like a nice guy." So he
mm.
actually, and they reversed it partly because even the prosecutor himself, yeah, they
Amazing.
said, I mean,
Mm,
he doesn't seem like he deserves to have his profession ruined, and I mean, he just tried to help
mm.
it go. And but a huge part of that was just openness throughout the trial, openness with him, being willing to listen to him, and
Yeah.
yeah, it's complicated. It's complicated.
I'd be interested in how you handle the trial because there's a friend of mine like who's called Ian Bray. He's one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion,
Huh.
and he's a Quaker.
Oh, wow.
Do you have Quakers in America?
We do
Yeah, I
not as
guess you
many as
do.
I'd like because the Quakers are awesome. There's one
Yeah, the
activist
Quakers are
who is
awesome.
raised Quaker in direct action Aurora named Louis Bernier. Do you know Louis? You might have heard
I've met him.
you might have
Yeah,
heard their name,
mm.
but
On
they're
Zoom.
tremendous.
Yeah.
They've done some of the most important actions, and they were raised Quaker. They're the only Quaker I know, but I've thought for years that we should be
Mm.
identifying more Quakers because I mean Quakerism is all about nonviolence and peace. So
Yeah, and yeah, very strong history of engagement in civil disobedience
mhm.
and all of this stuff. So yeah, but Ian, he's got that very strong spiritual foundation for him, and they had a trial. I think it was one of the first Crown Court trials for Extinction Rebellion, and there was about seven of them, very highly experienced. A lot of them had this like spiritual grounding, and they went and did this trial, and like Ian kind of spoke to me in like the way they approached it, and at least the way he approached it, he kind of saw it as just part of his practice. And so they went in with this radical honesty. They spoke about everything in terms of like the strategies, the long-term strategies, the goals of getting loads of people doing similar kinds of civil disobedience and all of this kind of stuff. So absolutely nothing was hidden. Um, but also practicing that like meditative, calm, non-violence throughout the whole process, from the journey to the interaction with the prosecutors, like, on the sides, through into the courtroom. And he kind of reported like the same kind of experience. Like the prosecutors like felt bad
Hmm.
for putting them on trial, and eventually the jury found them not
Wow.
guilty. But it wasn't like they of course they did preparation, and they had like a degree of legal strategy in terms of the arguments that they were going to make. But Ian said the primary reason he believes that they got found not guilty was because of that energetic like way of approaching things and treating it as part of like spiritual practice.
Yeah. A huge
So I'd
part
be
of,
interested in like if you were relating to it in a different way in like the trials that you were in.
yes, I think a huge part of effective courtroom advocacy, which is incredibly important, because the courtroom is sort of the platform for which all society's dramas unfold. It's just whatever the most intense
Mm,
disputes a society is having, whether it's race or gender or war, whatever it is. I
mm,
mean, at least in American history. I mean, I'm much more familiar with American history than most other countries, but I think even in other countries where I've looked at this, courts and trials tend to be very important. Um,
mm,
but a huge part of what you're trying to do, which the vast majority of lawyers cannot do and don't even understand why you're trying to do this, is dismantle all the pomp and circumstance of the law and just tell real
mm,
stories. And the reason a
mm,
lot of courtroom lawyers who have a lot of experience in the law don't understand this is because they're usually defending people who are trying to hide the truth. There are all
mm,
these facts and
mm,
evidence that they really don't want someone to find out about, that there's a murder
mm,
weapon that I actually had, or, I did actually steal the car. And so most lawyers, who are defense lawyers especially, are so used to hiding everything. And even prosecutors, because the prosecutors are playing this game where they're dancing between the rights of the defendant and the rights of the state and trying to pursue a criminal charge and potentially incarcerate someone, they're so used to this dance that they don't
mm,
understand how to just tell a good and compelling story anymore. They understand how to play a
yeah.
game. It's theater, but it's like almost multiple levels of theater. And I think
Mm,
effective activist advocacy is very different. And one of the things
mm,
I say in the training, I'm doing a training about legal advocacy and just how everybody can be a part of legal advocacy, is that
mm,
in most criminal trials, the goal is to sow doubt in the jury or the judge. You're trying to
mm,
convince them, oh, was this element proven? Was that element proven? And that's just in most criminal cases. If you watch some stupid crime show, you get a lawyer saying, they have not proven this beyond a reasonable doubt, blah, blah, blah. There's no evidence for this, whatever. And in
mm,
an activist case, you're doing almost the exact opposite. You're trying
yeah,
to
yeah, yeah, yeah.
inspire the jury to make a decision of confidence. You're trying to
Mm,
inject confidence and hope and belief in them rather than doubt
mm,
and insecurity. And this is why, I mean, just
mm,
the what you've said about security culture just has made me think about everything, because I knew this. I know
mm,
that's when I've been most effective. And honestly, that when we've been less effective in court, including in North Carolina and Sonoma County, it's because our adversaries have been able to get us into a place where we're not able to tell our story. And sometimes that's stuff that's just
yeah.
out of control, because they won't literally just won't let us talk about it, or they won't let us show photos and videos
Mm,
that we need to show to tell the story. But sometimes it's a self-inflicted wound, because the patterns
mm,
and practices we've used have been so distrusting and have been so like security culture oriented that it's kind of hard
mm,
to show that to the public or a jury in a way that doesn't seem like we're trying to hide things, like these are
mm,
sketchy
mm,
people who
mm,
are hiding their faces and up to no good, instead of just like these are
mm,
very open people who are just trying to do the right thing.
mm,
So there's almost it's almost not even just about the specific strategic consequences of holding things secure and confidential. It's about
mm,
the broader optics and the broader symbolism of how it shapes the movement and the organization and every single action you take, even
yeah.
in context outside of that particular tactic, right? Even something as
Mm,
stupid as, like, oh, whenever we do open rescues, we only tell people things when they need to know them. It's
mm,
it's just an operational tactic that makes a lot of sense, and you can argue for it. But
Mm.
when the average member of the public hears that this is like a very secretive group, that there's only a couple people who know things, and they start wondering, well, what do I need to know? I mean, what are they not telling me? Because what are they strategically withholding from me because I don't need to know this, and because they're just trying to achieve this objective rather than just being open about everything. And
yeah,
it's complicated.
I think it's one of the biggest challenges you're going to face, actually, because I mean, I know that you've spoken about like mass open rescues and stuff, and mass movements of open rescues and things. In that, because the strategic design challenge in maintaining open organizing is also you need action designs that are easy to pull off. Because if there are barriers where by putting security measures in enables you to achieve your goal, and you actually can't achieve your goal without some degree of security measures, then you have to bring them in. But then of course, and that has all the knock-on effects. So this is part of, I was talking earlier about the cat and mouse issue of like the horse races. So like by design, that was a very hard action to pull off. You had to build in all of these different structures. You had to build in knowing that we might have police infiltrators. Like the way we organized the Grand National was we broke into multiple different teams, and each team had like a team leader, and different teams were approaching the track from different directions, and people didn't know how other teams were doing it. And because if there was one infiltrator, then it would only blow part of the plan rather than blowing the whole plan. And because of the cat and mouse antics we were doing, you had to do it. But like where open organizing, I think, really can come into its own in like a really, really brilliant way is when your actions are simple. Like this is why I think road blocking has been such a critical tactic for the environmental movement in the UK, is because like all you need is people on a road and then to like sit down or to walk slowly. So you don't need any security culture for that. You can strip it out almost entirely. Well, you can strip it out entirely, and then you can just keep going. And like, so the challenge is I think around like there's such like strategic coherence needed in design around these things. Like it's like if you're designing strategy, every element has to contribute. It has to complement every other element, and then that's how you have like a winning strategy. And sadly, some of the best action designs don't measure up with some other like needed considerations, and so that's what I think might be your biggest challenge with getting into the mass open rescue space and maintaining this open organizing culture, because I don't know if it can be done with rescues.
Yeah, you're right. It's hard. I mean, the way we've approached it is we're pretty open about the fact that we're doing a rescue, and we don't say where it is.
Yeah,
and
that's what we're doing as well.
Yeah, I mean, because for example, Sunrise. I mean, the action we were convicted. I was recently convicted and thrown in jail for. I think all the team leads knew. But I think even the team members who are actually going into the farm, which, I mean, it was like 100+ people actually walked in. There were about 250 people walked onto the farm. There were 500 total, 250 outside. And there were about 100 who didn't just walk onto the farm property, but actually went inside the farms and tried to rescue animals. And if I remember correctly, I think most of those team members didn't even know where they were going that day, which is, it's weird because, and that does, I mean, it does create this weird culture of distrust, and it also it makes it harder to just organize, when people don't know where they're going. And it's just, I mean, even just saying like, hey, how much of my day should I take up? I mean, do I have to worry about, is it going to be an 8-hour journey or is it a 15-minute journey? They don't know. And so it did make it really complicated. That maybe it's one of the reasons we got 37 animals out and we got to tell their stories, which is independently important. So it is complicated.
Yeah.
And, one thing I think is just crucial in all of this, and I think this is multiple people have told me this about animal rising, and I'd be curious, maybe this can be our last question for me, because we're going over 2 hours and you got to get to sleep because it's late in the UK. One of the things that answers this question for us is just more strategic capacity. And Something my friend
Mm.
John, who I think you know, but a lot of other
Mm.
people have also shared with me at Animal
Yeah,
Rising,
that's
is just
fun.
the number of extremely competent, smart people you've been able to recruit and put into leadership positions. I think
Mm.
almost everyone involved in DXC would say one of our biggest problems was we never created that. The way Almir used to put it is we don't have a middle management layer. we have
Mm.
we have like leaders, and then we have organizers who have like peripherally involved, but don't have strategic
Mm.
capacity and are not, for whatever reason, whether it's our training processes or recruitment processes, or I don't know what the problem was, but you really do need a lot of people who can intelligently adapt to new situations. And this is
Mm.
even a concept that Marshall Gantz came up with called strategic capacity, that he said one of the reasons
Mm.
the farm workers movement succeeded in the 1970s was our approach to organizing was to develop strategic capacity. We had a lot of people who could adapt to various situations, could figure out on the fly what to do in a way that was
Mm.
consistent with our values and our mission. And what I've heard from multiple people who've been involved in organizing, like Aiden has told me this, John has told me this, is AR, meaning Animal Rising. By the way, I think it's genius that you guys came up with a name that actually, every time someone talks about the animal rights movement, it's a little confusing whether they're talking about the animal rights entire movement or your group. Because now, like, whenever someone says like AR, I'm like, oh yeah, animal rights. No, I meant animal rights. But
Mm.
what I've heard from many people, and I haven't seen this myself, and I'm really excited to come out and see it myself, is
Mm.
that there's just a lot of really smart, capable people involved. And you've done a good job of
Mm.
elevating them and giving them opportunities to exercise their intelligence and strategic judgment. Do you think
Mm.
that's an accurate characterization? I mean, maybe you
Yeah,
can't say
I think
otherwise
so.
as a
Yeah,
founder.
we got a great team.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
how
I
did you
really
get
do
there? How
believe
did you
that.
get so
Yeah.
many people? How did you like find Rose and Ben and all these other people who are doing, and Alex Lockwood and James Osden? What was it that brought all these people together and allowed them all to flourish?
Well, I mean, again, I think there's a lot of design elements that makes this happen. So I'll focus on a small number. But so first of all, I mean, the big ambitious plans
Mm-hmm.
pull a lot of people out the woodwork. So a lot of great people. You're in a grassroots space, right? Like good people could be off doing all kinds of stuff. They could be earning decent money and da 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 da. So the big ambitious plans is a really key element in terms of pulling good people into the space, and then it's strategically coherent and all this kind of stuff. So then you have good people see good stuff as well and go, oh yeah, that. And this is like one of the things that I have observed. Like people who are really on it notice things about it, and so then get drawn
Mm-hmm.
in terms of like how we organize and things like that. Um, but then we the way we kind of like organize and recruit people is we tend to. There are some exceptions to this, but the vast majority of people we pull up out the grassroots.
Mm-hmm.
So people who are, and we have ways of people taking on volunteer leadership, like I'm sure you do in DXC. And as people take on volunteer leadership and are doing really great work, it's just very quick to spot them and be like, come on full time. And I mean, I don't know what culture is in America around like paying people for activism, but like there was a recognition that if you want good people, you need to be able to pay them a wage, just
Mm-hmm.
enough just to live on, like just like needs basis type thing. So whereas previously in the UK there was the culture was very anti-money,
Mm-hmm.
and like money would corrupt and all of these kind of things. So we kind of went in the face of that and said, no, if you want people and
You
you
got to
want
pay
good
them.
people, you need to got to pay
Our
them.
first website had a
Um,
do not donate button.
yeah.
Speaking of a
It's
culture, yeah,
it's
we had a very strong anti-money culture in the beginning.
yeah, it's one of those. It's one of those great like radical ideas that you soon realize is a load of rubbish
No,
once
the
you start trying to
revolution will
do
not be
stuff, isn't it?
funded.
Yeah. I used to have all those
No,
ideas
I did
too.
too.
Like
Yeah, I agree.
I resisted the idea of money when I
Yeah,
first heard it in another movement. I was like, no, you can't pay people.
no,
This is
no, I agree.
volunteerism and
Yeah,
all this kind of stuff.
absolutely.
But yeah, so being able to compensate people, but yeah, it was that pulling people up, giving people responsibilities at the volunteer level, then pulling up the good people into organizing roles,
Mm.
and then once they're in organizing roles, it's having the structures of support in place for people, because people will do. Again, this is like against the kind of like horizontal values that often exist in social movements. It's like actually people do really good work and are able to really excel and really develop when they're in when they're in roles and they're getting support in those roles and they're getting guidance
And
and
some
they're getting
structure.
direction.
Yeah, I agree.
So building in structure, building in strategic direction, yeah, gives people a lot of space to develop and to the skills that they have to really excel and materialize. And um, so yeah, and then another element is it's choosing well and bringing people on when you're sure about them, but also if there are mistakes and people aren't cultural fits, or they're better off organizing in another environment. Really, it's being quick to spot that, and it's kind of it's very corporate approach really in terms of like hire slow, fire fast.
Yeah.
Like I think in order, it's just running an effective organization, you have to take that approach, and it's like because some people come in and they're very strong, on security culture or very strong on purity politics or something like that, and it's like, well, that's not who we are. So, and you have to let people go. So having a willingness to do that, I think, is really, really important. Because otherwise, and I've seen this happen to I've seen this happen to DXE.
Yeah.
If
Our approach was fire
you,
never.
yeah, which is just
we were like hire
disastrous.
slow, fire never.
Yeah, but what's been the result of that is
It's a disaster. I
my
agree. It's a complete
perception
disaster.
is that the really good people leave.
No, you're right.
Like because to retain good people, they need good people around them.
Yeah, no,
And
you're right.
good also in fitting with our theory of change and all that kind of stuff. So it's it's those kind of things. And then
The
what we've
problem, Dan, is
recently
every
started
time.
doing.
So we remove people so infrequently in DXE history.
Yeah.
But every time we remove someone, we were accused of being a cult, which is really weird because cults usually don't remove people. They like force you to stay, right? But I swear to God, I mean, the biggest explosion, honestly, the explosion that Mark Westcombe warned me about was about the removal of someone from our legal team. And we didn't even kick her out of the organization. We just kind of removed her from her position on the legal team. And it was just like, oh my God, this is such a disaster. And so people are really scared of doing those sorts of things because you see what happens when you remove someone. You look at what happened to Wayne, and you're like, oh shit, this is kind of what happens when you remove somebody in a social movement,
Yeah, but I think you have to. My understanding of this is you have to be like. I mean, it was very hard in your case. I mean, I think yeah. So I'm not gonna. I totally acknowledge how hard the stuff that went on in DXC was. So I'm saying this may be a bit of a privileged position, but you have to be, because we didn't experience anything so bad, but you have to be willing to just get a lot of flack, because also like the people who are the kinds of people who are going to be making cult allegations, they're not the people who you want in your movement. Because they're the people who are antagonistic, who create high conflict cultures, who drive other people out. Like, we're on the fringes, right, as an animal rights, and so we attract a lot of people from the fringes of society, and a lot of that comes with really good stuff, but also things that isn't conducive to building healthy team dynamics and things. So, I mean. Yeah, so I'm very much of the view of you have to very externally, and this is why I'm like happy to talk about it on this call. You have to very externally talk about your values, how it is that you be together in a team, how it is you want people to be together in a movement, what behaviors are acceptable, what behaviors are unacceptable, so that. And I think if you do that really consistently and very clearly, and then you're willing to step in when there is individuals who cross that boundary, in significant enough ways and cross those red lines. Initially, you get a blowback as others who are kind of have an affinity to that kind of behavior and that kind of culture fight back. But then eventually, if then they go, then suddenly you have. Because my view is you need a movement full of just ordinary nice people, which is the vast majority of the population. And so once you have that culture, then suddenly, like, it just attracts
Yeah.
those people and everyone's happy. But yeah, I really think in the social movement space, yeah, the biggest failure that we have is the inability to remove people who, and I'm saying this, by the way, as someone who used to be like a radical left, purity politics, hyper conflict person. I was someone who I would have removed back it like totally. I would, because yeah, I'd be like, can't have him in here. He's going to be causing so many problems. So it's not even like, it's not about the individual. It's not about the person. Like the
So,
person's bad, but sometimes like
yeah.
the culture that they've fallen into is bad, or
Yeah.
they're in a phase of life that so yeah.
So future Dan would remove past Dan.
110%.
That's
Like, wouldn't even
hilarious.
blink an eye.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a reflection of your
Yeah.
growth and your character that you're even able to acknowledge, that sort of thing about your past. And I wish all of us could be so humble and thoughtful about the growth we need, not just and that we've achieved in the past, but that we can achieve in the future. All right, we've been talking a while. Any last things you want to talk about before we shut things down? You get to go to sleep, because I know been hearing through the grapevine that you're already exhausted, and I don't want to contribute to that because we need your energy, Dan. Your energy is very, very powerful for this movement. So
yeah, well, energy wise, I'm doing okay.
Oh yeah, okay.
But this is the theory and practice thing. I've been in practice a long time. I need to step into just the space of zooming out, because otherwise I'm just gonna. Yeah, it's needed every so often, isn't it?
Yeah,
I'm sure
I think that's
you
smart.
you can relate to this. But no, like I could keep talking for hours with you, I think.
Yeah.
So maybe it's just like there's other things on my mind, but
Yeah, we'll
it
do
can
it
be for a
again.
future conversation.
We'll do it again. We'll do it again. And I better invite you to come to the United States. I mean, we could probably get you a place to stay almost anywhere in the country, because we have supporters everywhere. So, but you should definitely come out and do as many talks, workshops, lectures as possible, because you definitely have some pretty compelling ideas that even if people disagree with them, they should hear them, about things like security culture and direct action. But I'm going to try and come to the UK at some point too. So we'll hang out in person, and so I can learn a little bit about it. I definitely want to sit in on these trainings you're doing, because I just want to see how you do them and how you're getting so many people involved. I'd also just love to actually see your ladder of engagement unfold, and maybe even participate in it, like be a participant and see how you're walking people through it. One thing Rose told me that was pretty fascinating is I think some of your initial trainings are like multi-day. And it's funny because I've been advocating for our trainings to get shorter, right? Because I'm just like, oh man, they're so long. Not because there's not a lot of stuff we can go through, but because I just thought, no one's learning anything from these trainings anyways. They're just like an introduction. So just make them really short so they're really accessible and everyone wants to do it. And then, Rose is telling me that part of what you're trying to achieve, though, is just a sense of camaraderie among the people who are being trained together. But I was like, oh yeah, of course, that is kind of a huge part of it. And if you do 1 hour training, I mean, it's just you're in and out. Like you don't have any connection anymore, right? It's just whatever. I mean, just a bunch of random people in a room together for a lecture or something. So anyways, I think I'd really enjoy just going through your process personally and seeing how it works out, just given the successes you've had. And maybe I could share a couple things you guys can learn too. So so anyways, there'll be many future conversations, I'm sure, but I'm really excited about the future for both you and for the animals, partly because of the work you guys are doing. So keep it up, Dan. Keep it up.
And I should say as well, while we're on the call, because I didn't express this yet in this conversation, in that I've been following Direct Action Everywhere probably about 2015, like just like and like on a hyper closely. I would just track your social media so regularly. And I remember when you were doing the Petaluma rescues in like 2017.
The mass open rescues were in
2018,
2018.
the mass open rescues,
Yeah.
2018, yeah, the ALC conference. I remember just sitting there watching the live stream of that pretty much all day from back in the UK. I wish I was there, and like you guys were so inspiring, and like and I was just like, this is what's needed, and like those of us in the UK who was with the time was like, BXC is just like the hottest thing in terms of like this movement, and like. And so I've just like been watching over the years with just like such a degree of awe and like so much learning from you guys, and also talking to Almira and Priya over the years and things. I'm surprised it took us so long to have a conversation.
I think it's just because I've been tired. Because I've been meaning to reach out for many years, and I've just been so tired. And yeah, that's something I need to work on.
I was a bit intimidated, to be honest.
Really?
I was a bit intimidated to reach out because I knew how smart you were, and so I was just
now
like,
you realize how much of an idiot I am.
I was like, oh, it's Wayne. Yeah. I was like, well, Wayne's got to come to me, and then I can have a conversation.
Well, I'm glad we made it happen. We'll do another one soon, and we should. Well, I can't talk to Almira, but I was saying, you and I and Aiden and some of these other folks who have been some of the intermediaries between the two of us maybe can join that conversation at some point, because I think there's a lot we can learn from each other.
That'd be amazing.
All right. Thanks so much, Dan. I appreciate the time.